Step out of the car. Hands up. Celeste froze. Still strapped in, baby in her arms, black, late at night, in this neighborhood? That's enough reason. Before she could speak, she was slammed to the pavement. Her baby screamed. Blood from her forehead dripped onto its cheek. No warrant, no crime, just skin color and a badge, drunk on power. But what he didn't know was this. Her husband isn't just anybody. Where do you live? Is justice still justice where you are? Celeste Morgan left the supermarket at 11:43 p.m. The neighborhood had long since emptied, with only a lone fluorescent light flickering and reflecting on the damp pavement after the rain. She carried Malik in her arms, the 6-year-old son who had fallen asleep after a long day. The boy clung to his mother's neck, his head resting on her shoulder, his steady breathing lulling the weary rhythm of her heart after her third consecutive shift. The grocery bag swung at her side as Celeste quietly opened the car door. There were no sudden noises. Every movement she made was a choreography of habit and vigilance, a reflex shaped by years of living on the fragile line between ordinary and suspicious. She buckled Malik into the back seat, tucking the small blanket around him. Then she got into the driver's seat and started the engine. Her fingers had just touched the gear shift when headlights swept across her view. The white and blue patrol car glided past her hood and braked sharply, blocking the front. No siren, no loudspeaker order to stop, no signal from the warning system. Just a hunk of metal bearing the symbol of authority, appearing as if she had committed a felony. Celeste blinked and checked the rearview mirror. No one behind. No passing cars. She had done nothing wrong, that sentence repeated in her mind, as if to steady her breathing from breaking apart. The driver's door of the police car flung open. A white officer stepped out, tall, shoulders hunched forward, eyes free of anger, yet exuding a kind of pressure hard to explain. He didn't need to yell. His presence alone thickened the air. Celeste didn't lower her window. She kept her hands on the steering wheel. Her head turned slightly to glance at Malik. The boy was still asleep. She looked at the mirror, saw him approaching, each step deliberate as if he had already marked her position. He stopped by the car window and finally spoke. "What are you doing here at this hour?" His voice wasn't loud, but dry. Not the kind of question meant to understand, but the kind already laced with suspicion. Celeste tried to keep her voice steady. "I just finished my shift. I'm taking my son home." He nodded, the kind of nod used to check whether the answer aligned with the image he had in his head. His eyes shifted to the back seat, saw Malik. No particular expression. No cute kid or "it's late," like some officers might say when they had no intention of escalating things. License and registration. Now. Celeste swallowed lightly. She reached into the purse on the passenger seat, making every movement slow and deliberate. Her other hand stayed on the wheel. Her husband had taught her, don't argue, don't rush. Don't give them a reason. She handed the documents through the half-open window. "Is something wrong, officer?" He smirked faintly, did not answer, didn't take the papers right away, just stood there, eyes locked on her, as if analyzing every breath she took for signs of guilt. Then he asked, "Is your kid asleep?" Celeste looked into the rearview mirror. Malik hadn't moved. "Yes, he's asleep." He nodded slightly again, then fell silent. In the thick air between them, Celeste knew this wasn't a stop born of reasonable doubt. This was a stop for one reason she could never change, her skin color. "ID? Registration, why are you here?" he repeated, this time with a growl. 3 questions in a row, like someone reciting a default list of offenses reserved for people of color who show up at the wrong time in the wrong place. Celeste held her documents out the window, still keeping her voice steady. "Here's my ID and vehicle registration. I just got off work. I'm taking my son home. Address? 46th Street, right at the corner of Elm and Chestnut. About 10 minutes from here by car. Occupation? Night shift nurse. Where do you work? St. Mary's Hospital. Can anyone verify that?" She didn't answer right away. The question was no longer administrative. It was an interrogation, as if she were standing in a courtroom for simply existing in her city. "I don't think I need to verify my job just because I went out to buy milk for my child," she said, not raising her voice but not bowing her head either. Garrett Cole sneered, a crooked, dry, fleeting smirk. "Is that how you talk to the police?" He stepped closer, planting both hands on her car door. "Step out of the vehicle." Celeste froze. "I don't understand. What did I do wrong?" "Step out of the vehicle." This time he shouted. Malik stirred, lifting his head from the back seat, his mouth silently forming the word, "Mama." Celeste turned just enough to whisper reassurance. "It's okay, baby. Just a quick check. Sit tight, all right?" She turned back to the front, both hands on the wheel. "Officer, I will step out. I just ask you to be gentle, my son." The sentence didn't finish. The car door swung open with force from his side. He yanked her arm, pulling hard enough to throw her off balance, twisting her half out of the driver's seat. "What are you doing?" The only protest that escaped her came just as her head was yanked backward. Garrett had grabbed the bun at the nape of her neck, dragging her out of the car as if he were hauling out a sack of garbage. Malik screamed from the back seat, his child's voice breaking. "You're not cooperating. Resisting enforcement. You're obstructing an officer in the line of duty." Celeste tried to stay balanced, but the pavement rushed up toward her face. Before she could regain posture, her knee hit the ground. Then her entire body was forced down, her cheek grinding against the cold, coarse edge of the curb. She wanted to say her name, to call her child, but her throat locked under the weight of his knee pressed into her back. "Don't move," he said, breathing steadily, not the least bit out of control, as if this were a daily routine, nothing out of the ordinary. One hand pinned her shoulder, the other rummaged through her pants pocket for her phone. No warrant needed, just this. He wanted to. So he did. Malik was screaming, "Mama! Mama!" Celeste felt tears fall to the curb, not from pain, from helplessness. There was no one right now who could stop him, and in that moment, what consumed her wasn't fear, but humiliation. The metallic taste of blood flooded Celeste's mouth as her jaw slammed into the concrete. Her tongue hit her teeth, then oozed blood. Her lips split, stinging like hundreds of needles piercing her skin. "Don't move," Garrett Cole hissed, his knee driving into her spine. Not even a millimeter. She didn't resist, didn't twitch. Her face turned to the side, cheek pressed to the cold, abrasive road, her breath bouncing back from the rough stone. She heard Malik crying behind her, the sound choking like it might snap his breath in two. "Mama, Mama, stop! Don't hurt my Mama!" Celeste closed her eyes, not because of the pain, but because she feared that cry would follow her child for the rest of his life. Garrett said something into his radio. His voice was not rushed, not shaken, as if he had done this just yesterday and had no reason to worry today. Then suddenly he changed position. He didn't release her. Instead, one hand gripped her shoulder while the other grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the back of the vehicle. She had no idea what he intended, but the back of her shirt scraping against the curb made her hiss from the sting. When they stopped, her face was less than half a meter from the rear passenger door. He opened the back door. Malik nearly lurched forward in his child's seat, still crying out her name. "Mama! Mama! There's blood! Where's the blood from?" Celeste turned her head. Blood still oozed from her lip, dripping down her chin. Malik was reaching out, his small hand touching hers, and in that split second a drop of blood fell from her chin onto the collar and hand of the little boy, a red dot on his shirt, not large, but stark against the blue fleece right over his heart. She jerked her hand back, trying to stop it, but Garrett immediately tightened his grip on her wrist, pressing her head back to the pavement. "I said, don't move." Malik panicked, his eyes wide as he stared at the blood on his hand. He didn't understand what was happening, only that his mother was on the ground being held down and no one was helping. Garrett turned away as if nothing serious was going on. He reached into the back seat, pulled out Celeste's wallet and phone. No gloves, no explanation. He acted as if the car were his, and she was just some foreign object to be removed. "Mama, does it hurt?" Malik asked again. His voice was smaller now, as if caught in his throat. She wanted to say no, but the words wouldn't come. Each time she opened her mouth, the taste of blood filled her tongue. A second police cruiser crept silently into view from the end of the block. Headlights beamed across the street, casting Garrett's shadow long over the pavement, like a dark stain spreading across her body. There was no one right now who could stop him. And in that moment, the only thing Celeste could think of was not fear, but shame. Shame to be dragged like a criminal. Shame for not being able to stand in front of her son. Shame for knowing Tonight would be the first thing her child remembered when he thought of the word police. Northridge Police Department, holding room number 3. The ceiling of the interrogation room was coated with white paint that had yellowed, stained by time and cigarette smoke. The wall clock had stopped at 2:17, and no one bothered to fix it. Celeste sat motionless in the metal chair, red marks still visible on her wrists from the cuffs. Her eyes were dry, but her entire body throbbed as if it had been torn apart and stitched back together with rags soaked in grime. It had been 6 hours. 6 hours since she was dragged out of her car, since her blood had stained her child's face, since she was pinned to the pavement like a threat. 6 hours since the ordinary life of a mother was shattered into fragments, just because she was in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong skin. No one told her why she was being held. No one read her rights. No one explained the procedure. A night shift officer walked past, glancing into the interrogation room as if looking at an empty chair. Another one, likely the shift sergeant, set a form down on the table. She looked at the holding description. Uncooperative demeanor, minor resistance. Uncooperative demeanor? She remembered the moment she handed her documents out the window, saying, "I just got off work." She remembered Malik's confused eyes watching his mother pinned to the ground. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't fought back. She hadn't pulled away. But that didn't matter. To them, the only attitude required to justify the accusation was existing in her skin. Less than 30 minutes later, a female officer entered. Young, uniform still crisp, blonde hair neatly tied back. She carried nothing but a plastic cup of coffee. Sitting down across from Celeste, she didn't offer a greeting. "Are you Celeste Morgan?" "Yes." "Age?" 37. "Residence?" 46th Street, Elm and Chestnut. "Any witnesses to the incident?" "No, just my son. He's 6, the female officer nodded, scribbling a few lines, and she didn't look up once. "I want to speak to a lawyer," Celeste said, for the first time since being brought into the room. The pen stopped. The female officer looked up, a slight curl of the lips, almost a smile, but not quite. "A lawyer? You're under administrative detention. No to criminal investigation. I have the right to legal counsel if I'm being accused of anything." Celeste's voice was calm, not angry, but not meek either. Her throat was parched, her head still spinning. The female officer laughed. This time it was real, a short, sharp laugh, as if she had just heard a bad joke. "Someone like you knows the law?" The words landed like a hammer to the forehead, not loud, not profane, but filthy, in the way only those who've lived inside the system understand. You're black, you're a woman, you're small. Do you know the law, or did you just pick up those lines from TV shows? Celeste looked straight at her, no flinching, no anger, just asked, "Someone like me means what exactly?" No answer. Only the silence of power is long used to never having to explain itself. And her son, little Malik. Before being brought into the interrogation room, Celeste had only caught a glimpse of a young female officer carrying Malik out of the parking lot. The boy was still sobbing, arms wrapped tightly around the stranger's neck in panic. No one asked where she wanted her child to go. No custody papers, no conversation. They had only said one sentence: "We're taking him to temporary care services." And that was it. Celeste was pushed into the station and her child disappeared behind a door. 6 hours later, she still didn't know where Malik was, whether he was scared, whether he was hungry, whether he believed his mother would come back, or had already started to believe otherwise. When transferred to the administrative unit, Celeste requested to review the footage from the patrol car's dash cam, the kind federal law mandates must be activated during all civilian stops. A middle-aged officer, bald and round as a barrel, flipped through a file with one hand and sipped coffee with the other, responding without even looking at her. "Dashcam data lost. The file was corrupted during recording. Can't retrieve. Can't retrieve? Correct. Memory overwrite error. Are you sure? I just report what's in the file. You can submit a complaint form." No one was surprised. No one rushed to double-check. No one treated it as unusual. It was as if lost data was a more routine occurrence than regular equipment checks. Celeste sat back down on the cold, hard chair in the admin room, eyes fixed on the report in front of her. A part of her wanted to scream, "I have a 6-year-old who witnessed everything," but another part, the rational one, held her back. Would the word of a black child count more than a missing video recording? When she asked to speak with Internal Affairs, a staffer said, "The monitoring system isn't always updated in real time." Then who's responsible for reviewing it? Might be the shift supervisor. But there's no senior officer on duty tonight. Celeste understood. It wasn't that there was no one responsible. It was that no one had to be if they chose not to be. She tried to ask for the name of the officer who arrested her, Garrett Cole, but was met with a single reply: "Personnel information cannot be disclosed without an official legal request." A closed loop. No camera, no report, no name, no legal counsel because it wasn't yet a criminal prosecution. Everything existed in the gray zone, enough to detain someone, but not enough to protect the one detained. She leaned back against the wall, staring at the flickering fluorescent light above. For a moment, she imagined Malik sleeping somewhere, in a room far away and without her. Then a thought struck her spine with cold dread. If I don't get out of here, who will tell my son I didn't do anything wrong? A young officer passed by, saw her sitting alone, and hesitantly asked, "You okay, ma'am?" Celeste looked up. For a fleeting moment, his eyes met the bruise on her face, and clearly he saw it. But then he turned away, saying nothing more. No one denied what had happened. They just didn't document it. The woman sat there, back against the cold wall, her eyes dry after hours without sleep. The flickering fluorescent light overhead pulsed unevenly, casting shadows on the dark circles under her eyes and the dried blood crusting the edge of her lips. She didn't ask anything else, because now she understood. No one needed to say it. Every answer was already spelled out in the stares, the smirks, the indifferent footsteps that passed her all night. They hadn't beaten her because she did something wrong. They had beaten her because she looked like the kind of person they wanted to control. A black woman, alone at night, clothes plain, no makeup, face worn from a night shift. She didn't look like she belonged, and that alone was enough to become a question mark in the system's eyes. A question mark that needed no answer, just force. She remembered what her husband had told her years ago. If you're pulled over, just hand them your papers. They don't want the truth, they want submission. She did exactly that. She handed over her documents. She kept her voice calm. She didn't react, but none of it saved her. Because the problem was never how she responded, it was that she was there in the first place. That moment when the cuffs dug into her wrists, when Garrett Cole's knee pressed into her spine, when her blood dropped onto Malik's shirt and hands, was the moment she stopped being an individual. She became someone who looked like a target, and targets don't need to be understood. They just need to be subdued. An officer entered, holding her personal belongings. He handed them over like returning lost and found items. Without an apology, without eye contact. "You're free to go, no charges, but you should learn to cooperate better next time." The words fell softly to the floor, shattering like the dry laugh from the night before. Celeste nodded. No argument. She knew every answer now was pointless. She took her bag, slipped on the hastily folded coat. Her hand trembled as she checked her phone, not from cold, but from fear of seeing a message, not from her husband, but from child services. There was nothing. Just a few unread messages from co-workers. Her husband likely didn't know yet. She hadn't called. Something inside her didn't want him to know she had been treated like this. Like a criminal. Like a stain of shame on the entire family. Just before her hand touched the door, Celeste froze. Malik. 6 hours. And not a single person had mentioned her son. No confirmation, no piece of paper proving that her child hadn't been taken somewhere beyond her reach for good. She had asked, back in the interrogation room, but they had only said, "We're following protocol." She had wanted to ask more, wanted to demand names, phone numbers, addresses, anything, but she understood. Here, motherhood wasn't part of the official paperwork. Part of her wanted to turn back, slam her hand on a desk and demand to see her son before leaving. But another part knew too well. If she did, they'd say again that she was disruptive, non-compliant, and the spiral would start all over again. She tightened her grip on the bag strap and stepped forward. Ahead, the first light of morning spilled into the hallway, white and cold enough to make her shiver. And then, just before the door, she stopped at the glass bulletin board. Amid a clutter of pinned papers, job announcements, thank you letters from schools, training schedules, was a freshly printed flyer, stamped with a red seal. North Ridge Police, elite force protecting the community. Beneath was an illustration, a white officer bending down to hand a grocery bag to a child. Beside him, a black woman smiled brightly, holding a thank you notepad. Celeste stared at that paper for a long time. She didn't blink, not from emotion, but because she had never seen anything so perfectly false and so cruelly heartbreaking. She walked out the door, never looked back. Behind her, that flyer still hung there, perfectly flat, unwrinkled, as if no child had ever been separated from their mother just because they shared the same skin color. The sound of hurried footsteps chased after the figure, collapsing onto the pavement. They called her name without looking her in the eye. "Celeste Morgan, your son is waiting in room number 4. The room was tiny, with gray walls and neatly stacked toys. Malik sat on the floor, arms wrapped around his knees. His eyes were red, not from crying anymore, but from the kind of silence that comes when a child has grown tired of not being answered. When Celeste walked in, the boy said nothing. He stood up, walked to her, and wrapped his arms around her. No questions why, no need for explanations. He just held her tight, as if letting go meant she might disappear again. "Mama's here," she whispered, gently patting his back. "I'm sorry, I'm here now." Malik buried his face in her chest and gave a small nod. Outside, a social worker closed the door without a word. Washington, DDC. Federal Marshal's headquarters, 12th floor, office number 312. At that same moment, nearly 400 miles from North Ridge, Darius Morgan was stepping out of the weekly internal briefing when his phone vibrated quietly inside his suit jacket. The screen showed an unfamiliar number, area code 303. "Hello, Mr. Morgan?" A woman's voice, professional and official. "We're calling from North Ridge Civil Protection Services. Your wife, Celeste Morgan, was released this morning following an unfortunate incident." He stopped walking, eyes fixed on the glass wall ahead, where the city stretched out like a lifeless model. The caller kept speaking, but he no longer heard the words. His mind held only 3. Celeste, arrested. "Do they know she's my wife?" he asked, not raising his voice, not showing emotion. The other end went silent for 2 seconds. Just long enough to understand. The question wasn't meant to be answered but considered. Darius Morgan was Deputy Director of the Federal Marshal's Service, overseeing special enforcement operations across 3 national districts. He had coordinated major federal takedowns, sat in conversations with the Attorney General, and authored internal reform recommendations at the highest level. He wasn't a stranger to the system. He was the system, and for that reason, he understood better than anyone. Some things only happen when people believe no one would question them. And Celeste, with her bare face, old coat, and her family name, was someone they assumed would go unquestioned. He didn't call back right away. He sat down, opened his laptop, and pulled up the roster for Northridge's night patrol unit. He scrolled slowly, then stopped at a name he'd heard long ago, in a dismissed complaint filed by a former internal affairs investigator, Garrett Cole. A heavy breath left his chest, not out of surprise, but of confirmation. They truly didn't know she was my wife, and they thought that meant they were safe. Darius Morgan didn't rush to the North Ridge precinct, because he knew if he acted out of emotion, he would fall straight into the trap the system had long prepared, turning the anger of a black man into the reason to dismiss the real story. Instead, he opened an internal form on the Interagency Coordination System, where anonymous submissions from federal agencies could be used to request cross-mentoring. He filled in each field with a tone as cold and procedural as a machine. Urgent request for review of the legality of a traffic stop and citizen's arrest in North Ridge, between the hours of 11:45 p.m. and 12:20 a.m. the previous night. Reason: suspected improper use of force, procedural failure in issuing warnings, and possible civil rights violations under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. We request full footage from the dash cam and body cam, list of involved personnel, detainment order, handwritten reports, and supervisor confirmation, submitted by /anonymous Federal Internal Privilege. Priority level, high, due to possible systemic issue. He read it over 3 times. There was not a single word in a personal tone. No, my wife, my family, Celeste Morgan. Just a citizen arrested. A questionable act. A question that needed to exist in formal records. He hit send. The system responded. Request number 192137 has been received. Expected response: 48 hours. Immediately afterward, he submitted a separate request to the Independent Oversight Unit of District D, a query to retrieve the patrol log of the entire North Ridge unit from the past 3 months. Reason: investigating anomalies in the geographic distribution of nighttime traffic stops. This time, he signed it D. Morgan. 3 hours later, in Northridge, he walked into the police precinct without a uniform, without a nameplate. Black suit, open collar shirt, composed stride. He didn't say who he was, but the shift officer, having seen the audit request come in that morning, already had a guess. "Who would you like to speak with, sir?" "No one in particular." "Then, may I ask the purpose of your visit?" "I just want to see how things operate around here." His voice was soft, not sharp, but clear. A young staff member, likely just assigned for the day or new to the force, was tasked with escorting him. She was thin, still held traces of a college student in her face, hair hastily tied back, name tag askew. T. Ramirez. They walked through the main corridor. Dim yellow lights, the air tinged with coffee and old paper. He said nothing. She said nothing either. Only when they stopped in front of the shift schedule board did she suddenly speak, so quietly only he could hear it. It wasn't the first. He turned to her, said nothing. She didn't meet his eyes. There was someone before, also arrested by Garrett, also injured, but the complaint vanished. That person left the city afterward. "You know this because you saw it?" She shook her head. "I only heard, but enough to know around here, if you don't have proof, then the truth has no place." Darius gave a slight nod. Not surprised, not shocked. Her words only confirmed what he had long understood. In this place, wrong didn't need to be wrong. It just needed to repeat, long enough, often enough, and go unchallenged. After leaving the Northridge precinct, Darius returned to the federal office in D.C. He didn't rest. He didn't call Celeste. He didn't tell anyone on the coordination team. He knew, from this point forward, that every action must be taken as if he had no personal connection to the victim. He sat alone in his office, the door shut tight. He opened the internal federal data system, one only accessible to certain high clearance levels, a storage base for complaints, whistleblower reports, internal investigations, and files once closed due to insufficient evidence. The first keyword he typed was Garrett Cole. No results appeared. No one would be surprised. Men like him didn't leave obvious trails. He tried again. Northridge PD plus use of force. The screen responded sluggishly. A list appeared, most entries marked as sealed or withdrawn due to technical reasons, but one file stood out. Incident: 4227 BC, Denise Avery. Year 2018. Note: facial injury during nighttime arrest. No visual evidence. The report is inconsistent with the testimony. Case closed after 16 days. Darius opened the file. No photos, just a single handwritten page, scrawled, smudged by water in places. I didn't resist. I told them I had a small child in the car. I didn't scream. I only asked why. They dragged me out like I was a threat. I remember that man clearly. White. Short hair, small scar near his right temple. I can't forget his eyes. Not because I'm angry, but because I've never had someone do that to me without even trying to explain why. At the bottom, a shaky signature, D. Avery. The accused officer field was blank. The arresting officer field read, unidentified, image not verified. Darius zoomed into the corner of the form, where a faint blue ink note remained. Night. Supervisor that day, Sergeant Garrett Cole. He leaned back in his chair, hand resting on the desk, palm clenched, not out of shock, but at the chilling precision of a memory repeated. A woman, at night, child in the car, no offense. No resistance, yet treated like a criminal and everything erased simply because no one wanted to keep it. He continued searching for Denise Avery, with no federal employment record, no follow-up complaint, no presence in community programs, nothing after the year 2018. She had vanished from the system, as if after that night she chose to disappear, or had been forced to. Darius stared at the empty screen, thinking of Celeste, the woman he loved, who had held herself through countless grueling night shifts, who could handle an emergency room solo but wasn't allowed to ask, "What did I do wrong?" when her face was pressed to the ground. Denise Avery was the past that the system tried to bury. Celeste Morgan was the present that they thought they could crush the same way. But they were wrong about one thing. This time, someone was digging the file back up, and that someone was not a man they wanted to face. Darius Morgan opened a new data query, this time not to look for the victim, but for the habits of the assailant. Garrett Cole. His name surfaced faintly like a ghost in the system, not loud enough to draw attention, but consistent enough to leave a quiet trail of blood across white paper. Darius filtered all internal complaints submitted by citizens within the Northridge jurisdiction since the year 2015. 4 entries appeared, differing in time and sender, but identical in 3 aspects. All specifically named a white officer. Tall, with a close-cropped haircut and a southern accent. All described excessive use of force during administrative checks. And all 4 were dismissed due to lack of evidence, unavailable camera footage, or no third-party witness. One complaint from the year 2017, filed by a man named Harold Spence, stated clearly, "I was slammed against the hood of the car for refusing to show ID without being given a reason for the stop. I did not resist. I asked, 'Why am I being pulled over?' And that's when he yanked my arm down. He called me a smart ass, then smirked and said, 'Next time, keep your ID taped to your forehead.'" The complaint was dismissed after 11 days. Final note in the file, no footage, camera not operational. Another complaint from the year 2020, filed by a 19-year-old girl. She described being pinned face first against a brick wall behind a convenience store while waiting for a friend. Her statement included a line, "I still remember the look in his eyes. Not the look of someone afraid to do wrong, the look of someone certain he'd never be held accountable." Darius closed the file folder. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk. Each time he opened a case, a new pattern revealed itself. Garrett Cole only used force in black neighborhoods, and almost always at night. He picked up the phone and called an old colleague from the Civil Investigative Media Division. "Do you remember that Northridge case from a few years ago? The one where internal photos leaked from a Halloween party?" "Oh, the one with the cop wearing a shirt with the white extremist symbol? That's the one." That evening he received an email. The subject line simply read, "Halloween photo, never made public." He opened the attached file, a blurry photo taken on an old phone camera, shot from a slight angle. In the image was a group of police officers in costume, mostly superheroes, firefighters, and a few dressed comically. But in the center, standing out, was Garrett Cole, wearing a plain white t-shirt with bold black letters, "American Purity, one shade only." Below that was a logo of 3 overlapping W, a familiar symbol from a white supremacist group once investigated by the FBI in the year 2013. The photo never spread widely. According to the internal disciplinary record, Garrett Cole had written, "It was just a costume, a joke for the night." The internal review board accepted the explanation. The final note in the file read, "No further action, Halloween context. No intent proven." Darius looked at the photo again. The face in the image wasn't smiling. No wink, no drunkenness. His eyes stared straight into the lens, direct and cold, like metal under fluorescent light. And in those eyes, Darius saw no ignorance, only the certainty of someone who knew he would get away with it, because he had before. Darius Morgan didn't stop at reviewing records. He wanted to know what Garrett Cole looked like through the eyes of people in the force. He reached out to a former personnel coordinator who had worked at Northridge PD, someone who retired early after a psychological evaluation. The call went through after an hour of waiting. The man's voice was raspy but clear. "Cole? Yes. I used to assign him shifts. Every time there was a night slot in South End, he'd take it without hesitation. No one else even asked. Why? Because he knew no one checked over there. No fixed cameras. No wealthy residents, and most importantly, no voices loud enough to bother the higher-ups." Darius took notes. He asked, "What about his personality? Has anyone ever filed internal complaints about his behavior?" The man gave a dry laugh. "He doesn't need to be aggressive to be dangerous. He's calm, speaks little, always punctual. But the way he looks at people of color, it's like he always expects them to be about to do something wrong." Then he lowered his voice, hesitating. "To be honest, Garrett Cole is the kind of man who fears nothing. Not co-workers, not superiors, not internal affairs. Because he believes deep in his bones that he's protected." Darius stopped writing. That sentence, needing no further proof, said everything the records kept trying to avoid. Back in his office, Darius opened the arrest mapping software, a tool developed by the Marshal service to track local police patrol and stop patterns. He entered the Northridge zip code and filtered data for Garrett Cole over the past 3 years. The screen lit up with a digital map, each red dot marking an arrest or civilian ID check. The Central District, with a high percentage of white residents, was nearly spotless, but the eastern and southern zones, marked as low-income areas with high populations of Black and Latino residents, glowed red like a dense grid. Darius zoomed into the South End, the area where Celeste had been stopped. Within a 2-mile radius, Garrett Cole had conducted more than 40 stops in just the first 6 months of the year. That was an average of 2 times per week, over 4 times higher than the department's overall average. He switched to the second data layer. Racial breakdown of the individuals stopped. Nearly 90% were Black or Latino. Then he moved to the third layer, the rate of citations issued. Only about 12% had been fined or prosecuted. The rest were all labeled as administrative check or verbal warning. Darius didn't need to be an investigator to understand. He wasn't enforcing the law. He was hunting. And what kept him safe wasn't that he was good at hiding, it was that the system had never truly looked. Darius exported the data into an internal report, labeled it confidential, and titled it Garrett Cole Behavioral Map and Patterns of Implied Civil Rights Violations. The file was saved in a private folder, not shared, not yet. He looked at the map one more time. The glowing red dots were like blood splatters on the skin of a city pretending to be asleep. The map remained on the large screen. Red marks spread across the east and south sides of Northridge, not as neutral symbols anymore, but as the scars of hundreds of stops, checks, takedowns, and silent accusations. Darius stood before it in silence. He knew numbers didn't lie, and once they started to speak, there would be no excuse for the system to stay deaf. In Garrett Cole's report from the past 3 years, not a single white person had been stopped without a clear offense. Not one. In contrast, more than 80% of his stops involving people of color were justified with vague reasons, suspicious appearance, unclear nighttime activity, or worse. He turned to the wall on the right, where dozens of files had been pinned up, a line of names, not famous, not written about, but all sharing one thing: stopped, pushed to the sidewalk, and forced into silence because nothing serious happened. A man forced to lie face down for standing near an electronics store after 10 p.m. A mother's bag was yanked away to check for potential sharp objects. A 16-year-old boy was interrogated for his name and age just for wearing a hoodie in winter. No one had been beaten like Celeste, but all had been treated as if they owed the system an apology for simply existing in the wrong shade of skin. Garrett Cole didn't act randomly. He wasn't provoked. He wasn't impulsive. He scheduled. He chose the neighborhood. He filed the reports, and he left a clean paper trail. He followed every procedure, except the one called humanity. Darius closed his laptop. He sat down and opened the final file. Printed complaints from Denise Avery, then Harold Spence, then Celeste Morgan. 3 incidents, 3 different years, but the same pattern. At night, no camera footage. The subject was a person of color with no clear violation. Garrett Cole was the arresting officer. He wrote 1 line in red ink on the page in the center of the table. He doesn't choose targets, he chooses skin color. No need for elaboration, no need for argument. It was the one truth that couldn't be erased with the excuse of lack of evidence, because he had never needed evidence to act, and the victims had never been given enough ground to prove they were right. A report was about to be sent, but not yet, because he knew men like Garrett Cole weren't afraid of being accused. They were only afraid of being seen clearly, with nowhere left to hide. 2 days after the arrest, Celeste received a phone call from a police department representative. The man on the other end introduced himself with a perfectly measured, polite tone. So courteous it felt devoid of emotion. "We'd like to arrange an informal meeting to discuss a potential path for amicable resolution. Non-binding, of course." The meeting was set for Monday morning. A small conference room, a light wooden table, bottled water, and coffee were already in place as a gesture of courtesy. Celeste entered with a community lawyer, someone recommended by her friend. No cameras, no press. No official statement acknowledging that this was a case under investigation. Seated across the table were 2 men in suits. One introduced himself as the department's internal legal representative, the other a public relations advisor. No one wore a uniform. No one issued a formal apology. The legal representative spoke first. "Miss Morgan, first and foremost, allow us to express our sincere regret over what occurred. We understand the incident was an unfortunate misunderstanding, and we fully respect your feelings regarding it." Celeste sat still, hands on her knees, no nod, no reaction. Her eyes simply watched his lips move. To resolve the matter swiftly and minimize emotional strain on both parties, the department is prepared to offer a goodwill settlement. He then placed a black leather folder on the table, not thick, but pushed forward with a gesture so delicate it resembled the offering of a noble apology. "The proposed amount is $75,000. Contingent upon your agreement not to pursue the matter through litigation or release any information to the media." She wasn't surprised. She even smiled, a kind of smile that didn't come from the mouth but flickered briefly in her eyes. The lawyer beside her opened the folder, flipped through a few pages, and frowned. "Just to clarify, if she doesn't sign, will the department proceed with a formal internal investigation?" The man in the suit adjusted his tie, leaned slightly forward. "This is not a threat. It's simply an option to bring closure to the matter in a civilized, timely manner that doesn't damage the image of either party." Celeste looked directly at him. "The image of whom?" A brief silence. "You know," he continued, "we believe there are some things better left behind closed doors. Everyone needs a path forward." The sentence hung in the room like a velvet-gloved pat on the back. Soft, but meant to push. Celeste didn't answer right away. She simply turned to her lawyer and nodded slightly. "I need a few minutes." They stepped out of the meeting room into the quiet hallway. The glass wall reflected the image of 2 women, one with a law degree, the other with a bruise still visible on her cheekbone. "You know what?" Celeste said. "When he slammed my head to the ground, I thought, they're going to bury this." The lawyer looked at her, voice low. "And now they're asking you to bury it yourself." Celeste smiled, this time a real smile, but soaked in bitterness. Celeste stood by the glass corridor window, sunlight slanting through and casting half her face in light, half in shadow. In her hand was the printed settlement folder, $75,000 in exchange for permanent silence. Her lawyer was saying something about binding clauses, but the words no longer registered. The bolded phrases hit her eyes like blows. Agreement not to disclose information about the incident in any form. Waiver of civil or criminal legal action against any involved parties. Agreement is voluntary and not an admission of wrongdoing. She read each line as if staring at a suspended sentence. Without the name of the perpetrator, only the name of the one who agreed not to seek the person who made her bleed. A voice echoed in her mind, not from now, but from that night. Do you have anything suspicious? Late at night, with a child, alone. Hands up. I said hands up. She remembered Malik's eyes when he saw her blood on his hand. Remembered the small fingers that touched her cheek, then recoiled, stained red. Remembered the feel of concrete under her face and Garrett Cole's knee on her back, heavier than any punishment she had ever imagined. The folder in her hand was light, but the moral weight was crushing her soul, millimeter by millimeter. Her lawyer looked at her, speaking gently. You don't have to feel ashamed if you want to stop. Many people sign, and I don't blame them. She turned to look at the woman, not angry, not confused, just stunned. Stunned by the truth that, with one signature, everything would end. No more reports, no more confrontations, no more pain, but in return, a silence she would carry for the rest of her life. Soft footsteps echoed from the staircase. Darius appeared at the end of the hallway. He wasn't in uniform and wore no badge, just her man with that familiar gaze, calm but sharp like a blade still sheathed. He walked toward her, wasting no words. He looked into her eyes, then down at the folder in her hands. Is that the price for the truth? He asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She said nothing. He stepped closer, resting a hand gently on the folder. You did nothing wrong, so why stay silent? One sentence, not a rallying cry, not rhetoric, but it struck her like a bell. In the place where rage and fear meet. She tightened her grip on the folder, then slowly let it go. I won't stay silent and teach my child how to endure, she said, her voice low but steady. If we don't tell our story, the world will rewrite it for us. Darius nodded. No further words were needed. That nod was an agreement that if they moved forward, he would walk with her. Not as her husband, not as deputy director of the Marshals, but as a man who refused to watch truth be silenced with money. They walked back into the meeting room. The department representative still sat there, expressionless. Celeste placed the folder back on the table. I decline. The man raised an eyebrow. Are you certain? I'm certain. Then you're choosing to take this to court? No, I'm choosing not to help you bury what you've done. The lawyer beside her gave a slight nod, as if making it official. Outside, the sunlight had risen higher. The city bustled on, as if no act of violence had ever taken place. But on the third floor of this building, two people had just chosen a path few dared to walk, not because they believed they would win, but because they could not survive in a world where pain had a price and truth came padded with money. National Data Archive Center, Internal Retrieval Request Division. After the failed settlement meeting, Darius Morgan did not return home right away. He didn't need to ask Celeste whether she was certain of her decision, because he knew. Silence might protect one person in a single moment, but it could swallow entire generations if repeated often enough. He walked into the federal marshal's office at 6:10 a.m., while the hallway lights were still pale yellow and most departments were not yet full. He didn't turn on his computer as usual. Instead, he used his special access ID to enter the law enforcement behavior monitoring system. He didn't request an investigation into a single individual. He requested all arrest data from North Ridge over the past 5 years. The data was encrypted in multiple layers, sorted by shift, patrol route, zip code, race, time frame, reason for stop, and outcome. Not everyone knew how to read those numbers, but he did. He had been trained to expose hidden biases, patterns of behavior cloaked in administrative routine. After 3 hours of review, one number stood out, not written in any official report, but visible in the statistical map. 76%. Of all nighttime traffic stops in North Ridge, 76% of the individuals stopped were people of color. Darius narrowed his eyes and moved to the next column. North Ridge population statistics over the past 5 years showed that people of color made up less than 25% of the city. That meant for every 3 people stopped late at night, at least 2 were people of color, despite not being the majority group. He moved on to the reason for stop section. Nearly 60% were labeled unspecified suspicious behavior. Some listed driving too slowly, unusual movement, or matched prior suspect description, but none listed a specific violation. One final note made him pause. Neighborhoods with predominantly minority residents marked as priority zones in nighttime patrol allocation model per decision issued in 2019. Darius traced the decision back to the report from that year. The person who signed the directive was the chief of police at the time, who had retired the previous year, never investigated, never held accountable. The directive stated clearly, due to the high nighttime crime rate concentrated in minority neighborhoods, we propose increased patrols and surprise checks to minimize risk. But when Darius pulled the actual crime data from those areas, he discovered that criminal activity was not higher than in predominantly white neighborhoods. In some zones, it was even lower. In other words, they chose to police based on bias, not statistics. 76% wasn't random. It was the product of a deliberate filtering system. And Garrett Cole, with his baseless stops, his conveniently malfunctioning cameras, and the faces forced down onto the pavement, was merely the most visible link in the chain. Darius printed out the maps, the graphs, and the 2019 patrol allocation memo. He placed them into a file folder. Red cover, no personal names. Just one line printed in the center of the first page. The numbers don't lie. The problem isn't one person, it's the statistics no one is forced to see. Darius Morgan flipped to page 8 of the North Ridge Police Department's internal nighttime patrol coordination document, issued in 2019. The paper wasn't marked confidential, and no section was underlined, but buried among hundreds of routine commands, one phrase made him stop. Increase nighttime screening in areas deemed sensitive for security reasons. The phrase sounded harmless, like technical guidance, but he knew it was vague language like that, where the system hid its true intent. He traced the original documents to find a definition for sensitive areas. There was no explanation, no footnote, no accompanying map. Only a few address lists with coded markers, nearly all matching the place where Celeste was arrested, where Denise Avery once lived, and almost every area with a high concentration of minority residents. No justification, no basis, no need for evidence because everything had been legalized through vague language. Screening, a technical term that sounded like a medical procedure, but in this context, what did it mean? It meant stopping anyone who looked wrong. It meant searching pockets without cause. It meant forcing heads down to the pavement just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the wrong skin. Darius wrote one red line into the report. There is no definition for sensitive, because no one wants to write the words people of color. He hadn't sent the report yet. He was still missing one thing, evidence that couldn't be dismissed by language, something beyond administrative wording. And then it arrived. That night, an email was sent from an anonymous address. Subject line, "They said it, and I recorded it." The attachment was a 43-acket audio clip. The quality was not high. The male voice was slightly distorted with wall echo, possibly recorded in a precinct break room or patrol car. But the voice was as clear as breath in the ear. If I see a black guy at night, I stop him. No reason needed, I stop. Nobody's gonna stop me. Call it a sweep if you want. I'll just type suspicious movement in the report. Who's gonna prove otherwise? That voice was casual, like discussing the weather. And that was exactly what made the recording so chilling. No name was mentioned, but Darius knew. The danger wasn't in who said it. It was the fact that no one in the room pushed back. He forwarded the audio to the Internal Voice Analysis Division, not for criminal prosecution, but to cross-reference duty rosters, nighttime patrol teams, and identify who had been present when the recording was made. In the attached note, he wrote only one line, "I don't need to know who said it. I need to know who heard it, and stayed silent, because silence is what builds the system. The glow from the computer screen lit Darius's face, dim, cold, stripped of emotion. He had been here for nearly 10 hours, leaving his seat only a few times to boil water or splash cold water on his face, but his mind remained frighteningly sharp. On the screen, 5 data tabs were open. One file held statistical breakdowns of racially biased stops in North Ridge. One file contained the audio clip from the officer who didn't need a reason. One was a map of Garrett Cole's arrests over 3 years, detailed down to specific streets. Another was a chart listing reasons for traffic stops, nearly all vague, unjustified. And finally, a folder labeled Denise Avery Evidence, closed in 2018. He had everything he needed to set off an earthquake. All it would take was pressing send. The entire package would go to major media outlets, international human rights organizations, and the Special Investigations Committee. Irreversible, but Darius didn't do it, not out of fear, but because something was still missing. He understood this system better than anyone. The numbers could be reinterpreted. The audio was dismissed as doctored. The maps countered with arguments about risk-based resource allocation. He didn't need to spark outrage. He needed to spark undeniability. Because this system doesn't collapse under wrongdoing. It only trembles when the wrongdoing is seen by someone who cannot be silenced. He began rearranging everything, not by timeline, not by severity, but by patterns of repeated behavior. From there, he began constructing what few ever dared to build, a behavioral profile, not just of Garrett Cole, but of the entire structure that had created him. He reached out to a social data analyst who had once helped the Department of Justice detect irregularities in immigration policy. Without revealing too much, he sent a single question: how many repetitions does it take for a wrongdoing to become policy? The reply came back with just 3 words: 4 is enough. Darius already had at least 7. He sent a formal request to the Congressional Records Department, asking for a copy of the meeting minutes from 2019, the session where the phrase nighttime screening first entered official policy. He also sent an encrypted email to a former investigative journalist, someone who had once been threatened after exposing a police department that used racially biased facial recognition to detain innocent people. Subject line: I have a story, but not yet. Then he sat still, staring at the file that had now tripled in thickness since he started. He hadn't gone public, not for lack of data, but the final blow had to be one no one could recover from. Federal Department of Justice, 6th floor, unnamed internal meeting room. The meeting room had no nameplate, no cameras, no official record. Just 6 chairs, 1 large screen, and familiar faces seated around a table. People who attended meetings that never made the press. Darius Morgan sat at the head of the table. In front of him was a gray folder. No title, no logo, only a single typed sheet on top. Behavioral pattern analysis leading to systemic violations. North Ridge. Seated around the table were 5 people, 3 men, 2 women, all senior advisors within the Department of Justice and the Interagency Reform Commission. Each had sat through federal hearings on civil rights, reviewed hundreds of petitions, and rejected more than a few reports under the reasoning of insufficient weight. But today, no one spoke for the first 10 minutes. They flipped through the documents, they studied the maps, they read the old witness statements, they replayed the audio from the North Ridge precinct. If I see a black guy at night, I stop him. Nobody's gonna stop me. The voice echoed from the ceiling speaker, not identifiable, but unmistakable in its casual tone. It silenced the room, not because it was shocking, but because it resembled too much of what they had heard before and never addressed. Darius let the silence stretch. Then he said, 4 people injured, 2 lawsuits erased, 1 case file vanished from the system, and more than 3/4 of nighttime traffic stops over the past 5 years targeted people of color, even though they make up less than 1/4 of North Ridge's population. He slid the map to the center of the table. The stop rate of 1 officer is 5 times higher than the department average, in the exact area labeled for nighttime screening. The reason listed in most reports is unusual movement. No one defines what unusual means, because everyone understands it's just a coded way of writing the phrase, "They don't dare type, not white." One of the advisors, Mrs. Whitaker, head of the Civil Rights Legal Division, crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair. "What do you want, Darius?" she asked, her voice not raised but carrying the weight of experience and exhaustion. "A punishment? A model prosecution? Or to overturn the whole thing?" The question hung in the air, falling between the open folders on the table. In the stark white light of the meeting room, it was not rhetorical. It was a test to see whether the man sitting across from them was seeking justice or waging a crusade. Darius did not answer immediately. He looked at the chart in front of him. The red, blue, and yellow dots, each one marking a moment when an innocent person had been interrogated, humiliated, stripped of rights without a single formal charge. Then he spoke softly but steadily. "I didn't come here asking for a punishment, because I know if we punish one man and let the old system continue, then 6 months from now there will be another Garrett Cole." He raised his head. His eyes moved across the table. "I'm also not here to be a hero. I came to ask the one question we should have asked long ago. Who will be the first to not look away, knowing that silence will save their seat, but truth might cost them everything?" No one answered, but no one looked away. Federal Department of Justice, internal meeting room, 6th floor. Silence after Advisor Whitaker's question stretched on for over 10 seconds. As if no one in the room knew how to respond to the truth that had just been dropped. The white ceiling lights didn't flicker, didn't blink, but every face looked as if it had just absorbed a slow-motion lightning strike. Darius Morgan didn't blink. He was not the kind of man who weaponized personal pain to bargain with the system, but this time the answer could not come from data. It had to come from lived experience. He inhaled, not deeply, not hastily, then lifted his head, eyes fixed on the one who had asked, not avoiding, not angry. "I don't want anyone to ever have to stand the way my wife did, with her face pressed to the pavement, just because of who she is." His voice wasn't raised, but each word landed with the clarity of knuckles tapping glass. Every word dropped between the folders, between the people who were used to hearing accusations with detachment, not empathy. Darius continued. His tone did not rise, but something deeper began to build in the room. "They said she was uncooperative, but they never asked who taught her that silence was the only defense against a gun. They wrote in the report that she had an attitude, but they didn't note that it was the attitude of a mother trying to stay calm because her child was still strapped in the back seat." He looked down at the file, as if staring back into that night through the sterile language of administrative text. They thought she would sign that $75,000 would be enough to buy her silence, or if not, then at least buy her exhaustion. What they didn't know is that she spent her whole life teaching her son that silence, sometimes, is just another form of suicide. Male advisor, silver-haired, formerly a senior figure in the Southern Legal Division, furrowed his brow and said slowly, "You think we've never seen a case like this?" Darius turned to him. His voice was still steady, but his eyes carried something hard to name. "No, I think you've seen plenty, but there's one difference. This time I'm sitting in this room, not as a petitioner, but as the man who will send everything I have to the full interagency commission, to the press, to civil rights attorneys, and, if necessary, to Congress." He stopped speaking. Not a threat, not a bargain, just a simple declaration, a line in the sand. "You asked what I want? I want what my wife didn't have at the moment her face was pushed into the street. I want one officer, just one, to say, 'This isn't right.' I want a system where when someone pins another human being to the ground, no one can say, 'Nobody's stopping me.' And I want, in a city that calls itself civilized, for skin not to be the reason suspicion gets triggered." No one responded right away, but a woman seated at the end of the table, younger, silent throughout the entire meeting, gave a slight nod. No one else seemed to notice, but Darius did. A small nod, just enough to know that someone had changed sides. Internal meeting room, Federal Department of Justice. The meeting continued for nearly another hour after Darius's response. No one asked further questions. Instead, there were slow glances exchanged. documents quietly folded, pages marked and annotated, not because they didn't want to argue, but because there was nothing left to argue. The data was clear, the records are undeniable, and most importantly, the man sitting across from them was not a victim. He was a cog inside the very system they were running. It was not easy to dismiss the words of someone like Darius Morgan when he understood how the system operated better than those in the room, because he had once been part of the machinery that built it. After a while, the younger advisor, the one who had been silent from the beginning, lifted her head, hand resting gently on the edge of the file Darius had brought. "I don't think a single internal report will bring this to the public's attention." All eyes turned toward her, not out of disagreement, but because they all understood she was about to say something no one else wanted to be the first to say. "If we release this piece by piece, one stat at a time, it'll get filed under routine alert. The media won't stick with it. The departments involved will deny everything, and even if someone gets suspended, they'll be back in 6 months, once the outrage cools down." She paused for a beat, then she spoke, very softly, like voicing a suggestion that was both dangerous and inevitable. "We need an event, a moment, something big enough that the public cannot look away. If the system is fed by silence, then it has to be broken by an echo." No one interrupted. No one reacted. Darius tilted his head, looking at her. The first time during the meeting, his gaze had softened. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Another advisor asked slowly. She flipped to a page in the file. "A public hearing, sponsored by the Department of Justice, inviting witnesses, victims, experts, and representatives from the North Ridge Police Department. Not closed, not classified, live streamed." The silver-haired man on the left gave a quiet laugh. "You want to turn it into a stage," she replied, without blinking. "I want to turn it into a mirror. So the system has to see itself, and the public gets to see it more clearly." Darius looked around the table. He knew they were weighing not just the legal angle, but also the political risk, media blowback, and institutional reputation. But to him, everything had been clear since the moment Celeste was forced face first onto the concrete. "We need a kickoff, a shock wave that no one in the system can call an isolated case anymore." He nodded. A slight, slow but firm nod, and that very afternoon in a nameless room, the plan began to take shape, a plan none of them had ever envisioned before. Not a protest, not a hashtag campaign, not an isolated media investigation. A federal-level public hearing, with the entire system forced to show up, face the public, and answer. A conversation where the ones compelled to speak would no longer be the victims, but those long accustomed to the privilege of silence. Private Office Federal Marshal's Bureau. 3 days after the closed-door meeting, the morning began like any other. The early news broadcast still rolled out the usual headlines: financial markets, the political race, severe weather in the West. Nothing mentioned North Ridge. No one spoke the name Garrett Cole. Everything remained quiet, as if no seismic shift was about to happen. At 8:13 a.m., an anonymous Twitter account named @silentwitness_north posted its first tweet. "If your skin is wrong, the night can be your enemy. North Ridge Files." Attached was a 43-legged audio clip. The voice of a police officer rang out clearly. "If I see a black guy at night, I stop him. No reason needed. I stop. Nobody's gonna stop me." 10 minutes later, the second tweet appeared, this time with screenshots of internal data, arrest maps, racial disparity stats, and the phrase, "nighttime screening." Everything was cleanly formatted, time-stamped, and sourced. No speculation, no emotion, just the truth, presented in a format that couldn't be dismissed as subjective. 30 minutes later came an excerpt from Denise Avery's original complaint, along with a caption, "The first one forced into silence, but this time, someone's not letting it happen again." No one knew who the account belonged to, but in an office more than 1,000 miles away, Darius Morgan looked at the computer screen and was not surprised to see the tweet reshared by veteran investigative reporters, then picked up by younger journalists, then echoed by activists who had once stayed silent, because nothing had been strong enough to speak with them. He didn't retweet, didn't comment, didn't move, because he knew Sometimes, all it takes is one spark in the right place at the right moment, and the rest will burn on its own. By noon that same day, Northridge files climbed into the top 3 national search trends. 4 television networks launched special reports: systemic abuse or individual misconduct. Another broadcast carried a simpler headline: one night, one mother, one officer, and a silent system. But it didn't stop there. At 1:06 the afternoon, a journalist from the Liberty Standard published an in-depth analysis alongside a shocking revelation. Confirmed by sources, the victim in the recording is no ordinary citizen. She is the wife of a deputy director of the federal marshals, currently commanding national-level security coordination efforts. The media landscape erupted. Social networks shifted from outrage to systemic fury. If they're willing to shove the face of a high-ranking official's wife into the ground, what fear would they have left for the rest of us? Messages flooded Darius's phone. Calls from reporters, human rights organizations, and even state legislators began pouring into the marshal's office. Everyone wanted to confirm, was Celeste Morgan, the woman in the audio clip, his wife? He didn't confirm, he didn't deny. He simply released a pre-written statement to all media outlets with the first line reading, "We do not oppose the system. We oppose when the system is run as if humanity is something optional." Northridge Police Headquarters, 48 hours after the audio was leaked. Garrett Cole was placed on temporary suspension Tuesday morning by way of a 3-line notice in the department's internal bulletin. No press conference, no apology. The word violation did not appear in a single sentence. Only one phrase: additional time is needed to review Officer Cole's field coordination protocols to ensure transparency. The notice was issued at exactly 7:58 a.m. By 8:10, a local Northridge newspaper published a headline: "Officer named in controversial recording temporarily pulled from duty." No one said he was under investigation. No one confirmed that the voice in the audio belonged to him, though everyone who had worked with him recognized exactly who it was. Temporary suspension was not a punishment. Temporary suspension was how the system kept the public quiet long enough to prepare its counterstrike. Celeste received the notice in her email inbox at 3:04 p.m. that afternoon. A cold subject line: request for cooperation and investigation of behavior potentially provoking law enforcement. She read it 3 times, not because she didn't understand, but because even after bracing herself, she hadn't expected the boldness of the language. The letter, from the Personnel Department, requested her presence to clarify signs of non-compliance and possible obstruction of procedural duties during direct engagement with the Northridge Patrol Unit. No mention of being assaulted, no use of force, only direct engagement, as if she and that officer were 2 pedestrians who happened to bump into each other on the street, and now she had to explain why she was standing in the wrong place. Celeste picked up her phone, about to call her lawyer, but her finger stopped mid-air. For a fleeting moment, she felt something hard to name. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of cold exhaustion. She had expected this, but expectation didn't make it any easier to face. When exposed, the system does not respond with force. It responds with forms, with polite invitations, with administrative questions, with reframing the victim into a template. What did you do that made them act this way? Darius found out just minutes later. He didn't need her to tell him. A close colleague had sent him a screenshot as soon as the internal notice leaked. That evening he came home, took off his coat, washed his hands, and stood silently behind Celeste as she sat quietly at the kitchen table. On the table was a printed copy of the summons letter, next to a crayon drawing by Malik, a picture of mother and son, holding hands beneath a starry sky. "We expected this?" he said softly. She nodded. "And it still doesn't go down easily," she replied without turning around. He sat down beside her and took her cold hand in his. No squeeze, no more words. Just one truth they both understood. When the system is cornered, it doesn't attack the one who exposed it. It turns on the one who survived it. 3 days after Garrett Cole's suspension, Celeste was asked to appear for supplementary testimony related to the developing situation. There was no word investigation, no word victim. Everything was wrapped in neutral, polished, ripple-free language. Interview room 4 had frosted glass panels, a long wooden table, and 2 wide-angle cameras mounted on the ceiling, recording visuals but never emotion. Seated across from her were 2 individuals, an internal affairs representative and a legal compliance officer. They wore no uniforms. They didn't smile. They didn't look at Celeste any longer than necessary, as if she were just a name that needed to be processed out of the system. The session began with the usual questions: full name, address, and time of the incident. Then came what they called the real-time contextual clarification. The woman on the right activated a recorder, then read from her paper like she was reciting in a speech contest. Please be advised, this is a voluntary interview. All recorded content is used for behavioral cross-referencing purposes. This is not a prejudicial or prosecutorial proceeding at this time. Then she looked up. Ms. Celeste, we'd like to clarify certain aspects of your attitude and conduct during your engagement with law enforcement officers on the night of the incident. Celeste looked straight ahead. No flinch. Did you display any reactions, verbal or physical, that could be interpreted as provocative or uncooperative? A question was presented, as if it were reasonable. But the bitter truth lay in the starting point. It didn't begin with the event. It began with the assumption that maybe she had caused it to happen. She answered slowly, I didn't yell. I didn't resist. I said, I just got off work and handed over my documents. I did not act in any way I would consider provocative. The woman nodded, took notes, then continued. But according to the internal report, the officer noted that you displayed a non-compliant attitude when asked to step out of the vehicle. May I ask, did you hesitate or show any reaction when given that instruction? Celeste paused for a beat. My child was asleep in the car. I didn't have time to speak before my hair was grabbed and I was pulled to the ground, the man next to her typed. No one asked about her child. No one asked if she was injured. There was only one next question, quiet, gentle, but as out of place as a hand on the shoulder from behind. Do you think if you had acted differently, the situation might not have occurred the way it did? She looked directly into the camera lens across from her. For a moment, she didn't see the room, didn't see the 2 people in front of her, didn't hear the tapping of the keyboard. Everything went still. Only herself and the question she had faced in countless forms throughout her life. She answered, well, if my existence itself is seen as provocation, then is there any right way to live? No one said anything. No one responded. Only the soft hum of the recorder remained, capturing a question and a truth no one in the room dared to challenge. Federal Marshal's Library, Secondary Data Room, Friday afternoon. The letter arrived as ordinary mail, with no sender's name, no return address. A brown envelope, tightly sealed with tape. On the outside, written in thick black marker, were only 3 words in all caps: for whoever has the right to open. Darius received it late in the afternoon. A colleague placed it on his desk with a simple comment. Didn't go through the system. Looks hand-delivered. He opened the envelope with the utility knife methodically, the same way he handled classified case files. But what was inside wasn't data. Nothing was printed. Everything was handwritten, in slanted script, some lines crossed out, some shaking slightly as if the writer had been holding back tears. I'm writing this because I saw her face. I don't know her name, but I know that expression, that look. I once had that look, also on a night under streetlights, when I had done nothing wrong except exist in the skin I was not supposed to have. The first page ended there. The second was an old photocopy, a black and white photo of a woman with a bruise on her left cheek, a gash on her forehead, and a swollen lip. It didn't need color to reveal the pain. On the back of the photo was a caption, "Photo taken by local hospital, March, year 2021, Mississippi. The third page was a complaint form, stamped in red, insufficient grounds, case not processed. Below the ink was a line scribbled in a different pen. I asked them, not enough grounds means not enough blood or not enough witnesses. The final sheet was a small piece of paper, short, but it made Darius instinctively clench his hand. I thought I was the only one. Turns out I was just a name buried deeper than the others. No signature, no plea for help, no request for action, just a quiet confirmation that someone once believed she was an isolated mistake until she saw the truth dragged into daylight and realized her silence had once served as the very foundation the system stood on. Darius sat still for a while. He didn't take notes, didn't begin analyzing. He simply placed the complaint letter on the table, hand resting on the edge of the paper, as if he were holding on to something more fragile than any classified file, the memories of those once labeled insufficient evidence. Later, he brought the letter to the legal department for stamp verification. Through the signature identification system, a specialist confirmed the stamp belonged to a small police precinct in the South where Garrett Cole had once interned before transferring to North Ridge. There was no doubt anymore. No longer a rogue officer, no longer an isolated case. Garrett Cole was not a lone wolf. He was the first visible surface of a pattern, one built on protection, deletion, and red-stamped rejection. And people like this woman never disappeared. They had simply believed they were alone. Anonymous forum, thread titled, "I Never Dared to Tell," Sunday night. No one knew who started the thread. No verification, no profile picture, only a single opening line. I was pulled over in the year 2020. No clear reason, no violation. Just one question. Do you have anything suspicious about you? That one line opened a flood of stories, like hundreds of people had only been waiting for someone to break the first layer of silence. One woman wrote, "I was stopped driving home from a night shift. They asked what I had in the trunk. I said leftover food for my kid. They told me to open it. No warrant, no explanation. When I asked why, they shrugged. Driving around at this hour is suspicious." A black man wrote in from Texas. "I pulled over to make a call because my car was overheating. A cop shined his flashlight in my face and asked, 'What are you lurking around here for?' I said I was calling my wife. They asked for my ID and followed up with, 'Have you ever been arrested?' The first thing they asked wasn't, 'Are you okay?' It was, 'Got anything to hide?'" A single mother shared her experience. "I was stopped while driving my kid to school. The officer asked, 'Where are you two headed? Can you prove this child is yours?' I didn't know how to respond. I asked, 'Did I do something wrong?' They laughed and said, 'If you didn't, why are you scared?'" Another user commented underneath, "I'm not scared, I'm angry, but I was taught to call it fear so I could survive." Within less than 24 hours, the thread received over 400 responses. There were no shocking videos, no one ended up hospitalized, no blood, no guns drawn, just cold, procedural conversations, yet they all followed the same pattern. A person of color, an everyday situation, an intervention with no clear cause, and a question, always posed in some variation but never changing in meaning. What's suspicious about you? That question acted like a moral test sheet, forcing the victim to provide an answer despite having done nothing wrong. It reminded everyone of something they had long been conditioned to forget, that their very existence had already been defined as suspect, long before they ever spoke a word. Celeste did not join the forum, but her lawyer, the one assigned to monitor public response, had sent her a compiled copy of all the most notable posts. She read each line, not out of curiosity, but out of a need for confirmation, that her pain was not a distortion, that the feeling of being exposed, inspected, and put under a spotlight was not imagined. Each time she reread a post, the same question from that night echoed somewhere in her head. Where's your ID? What are you doing here? And again, she thought of the answer she never got the chance to say, I'm living. Isn't that enough? On the forum, one person had commented toward the end of the thread, we thought we were isolated incidents. Turns out, we were just scattered pieces of evidence, collected and filed by the system under no need for review. They had no lawyers, no media backing them. They weren't trained to answer reporters. They weren't familiar with clauses, regulations, or any of the usual language found in official complaint forms. Many of them didn't even know how to correctly name what had happened to them, because no one had ever confirmed it was real. But they had one thing in common. They had all heard that question. What's suspicious about you? What are you doing here? Out here alone? Just a quick check. Cooperate, and it'll be fine. These people, who once stayed silent because they thought their experience wasn't severe enough, not shocking enough, not bloody enough to be heard, were now beginning to rewrite their memories. Not to become headlines, not to take someone down, but simply because, for the first time, they were certain they were no longer the only one. On small forums, in the inboxes of human rights organizations, through printed letters sent by regular mail, the stories began to appear. An Asian woman whose bag was searched while waiting at a bus stop. A black college student was pulled out of a library for wandering too long without checking out a book. A single father asked for ID while carrying his child through a supermarket at dusk. None of them had power. None of them had a platform. But now, they had something the system never anticipated, a shared voice, and the first person to gather all of it was not an activist, not a politician, not a viral influencer. It was Celeste's husband. Darius Morgan didn't go on TV, he didn't give interviews, but he launched a private data channel where anyone could submit a short description, a photo, and a personal account. Every submission was digitized, categorized, encrypted, and stored. He called it the testimony map, not because he wanted to create a movement, but because he believed if the system was built on administrative documents, then it should be held accountable by documents too. He didn't ask, were you beaten? He asked, were you silenced? When the woman from Mississippi sent a second photo, this time an image of her complaint form rejected a second time, marked with the note, outside jurisdiction, he didn't just save it. He filed it under a dedicated section called Rejected Evidence, a formal category in his master report. Each story was time-stamped, geotagged, and formatted for cross-research with patrol logs from other police departments. No one told him to do this. There was no funding, no media team, just a document scanner, a secured database, and one unwavering belief. Every person who has ever been asked, "What's suspicious about you?" deserves to have their answer recorded for them, not for the system. And for the first time, hundreds of accounts, once dismissed as lacking criminal relevance, finally had a place to belong. Federal Court, District 9, North Ridge, preliminary hearing. The courtroom was wide, with high ceilings and fluorescent lights that failed to chase away the chill in the air. It was not crowded. Only a few permitted reporters, one representative from a human rights legal group, a mid-level judge, and the involved parties were present. There were no cameras, no live broadcast, no justice slogans printed over red or blue backdrops, just the opening session of a civil lawsuit, like the hundreds that unfold quietly each year. But Celeste knew this case was not like every other, because for the first time in many months, she was in the correct place. Plaintiff, filer, the one with the right to speak. No longer the woman from the clip, no longer an unverified victim, no longer somebody's wife, just herself. Her lawsuit was not filed as part of a class action. No organization backed it. It did not seek serious emotional damages or state-level compensation. It was a thin folder containing distilled testimony. I was pulled from my car without a specific cause. I was pinned to the ground without being asked a single question. I bled. I was humiliated. I was held for 6 hours without access to legal counsel. I want the federal court to affirm one thing, that what happened was wrong, even if I do not have a polished video, even if no reporters followed me. She filed her case with only one goal: to be heard in a room where voices like hers had long been suppressed beneath the language of procedure. Garrett Cole was summoned, not by arrest warrant, but by civil subpoena. He appeared on time, accompanied by an older attorney known for his toughness in government officer defense cases. He wore a white dress shirt. No insignia, no weapon, neatly knotted tie, polished shoes. He sat on the right side of the courtroom, across from Celeste, arms folded, leaning slightly back in his chair, and not once did he lower his head. When he looked at Celeste, there was no hostility, no fear, only one thing: the casual contempt of someone who had grown accustomed to seeing every incident end in an internal report and the word suspended. She did not look at him often, but enough to see he felt no need to defend himself. His lawyer spoke first. "My client denies any intent of excessive force. The stop and restraint actions were fully within procedural safety protocol, based on situational assessment at the time of the event." The judge made notes. He did not nod. He did not react. Celeste's lawyer followed. "We are not seeking high-level damages. We are seeking confirmation that the use of force against a civilian who posed no threat and had not been clearly warned was unlawful, regardless of race, gender, or socioeconomic status." The judge looked up. "Is this a case about dignity or justice?" Celeste looked him directly in the eye. "Justice, but not to win, to make this system sit down and listen for once." Across the aisle, Cole gave a faint smile. He said nothing. The next hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, but for Celeste, that single day was already a different kind of beginning. The first time she walked into a room where every question directed at her had to be recorded and could no longer be dismissed. The room was so quiet you could hear the turning of paper. The atmosphere was not tense, but it sank in the way it often does just before something shifts or gets exposed. Garrett Cole's attorney stood up. He was in no rush. Calm posture, steady voice, trained through hundreds of court appearances where he knew his task was singular: to plant doubt in the mind of the judge. "Miss Morgan," he began, eyes not on her but on the cover of the file, "can you describe how you responded at the moment you were asked to exit the vehicle?" Celeste kept her voice steady. "I didn't have time to respond." He nodded, as if inviting elaboration. "So, you didn't comply with the request?" "I didn't hear any request." He raised his head. "Are you certain?" She looked him directly in the eye. "Very certain." A brief silence. He shifted tone. "Is it possible that due to the stress of the situation, you didn't hear clearly? Could Officer Cole have issued the command and you just didn't recognize it as official?" Celeste didn't respond right away. Then she said, "If someone grabs my hair before saying a single word, I don't know what to call that. A command doesn't quite fit." No one moved in the courtroom. The judge continued taking notes. The prosecution side did not react. The defense attorney stepped slightly back, then said, "We request to present a new detail about the recording device. From a silver USB." He passed the file to the technician. A video clip began playing on the courtroom screen. The footage was grainy, lacking clear audio, but the yellow glow of headlights could be seen sweeping across the car's surface and the silhouette of a man approaching the driver's window. The camera wobbled slightly, keeping time with the rhythm of his footsteps. There was no warning, no command, not a single word spoken beforehand. Only a sudden grab. A hand reached in from outside the frame, opened the car door, and Celeste was pulled out of the driver's seat. Everything happened in 3 seconds, and in all 3 of those seconds, she did not move. She did not speak. There was not a single action that could be construed as non-compliant. The judge turned to Cole's attorney. "Was this clip included in the original case file?" The attorney hesitated, then responded, "The device previously reported an error. It wasn't until this morning that the tech department was able to recover a temporary copy. We haven't had the chance to review the full content." "No need for details," the judge interrupted. "Just confirm this: the footage does not show any verbal warning before contact." The lawyer fell silent, and that was when Celeste looked across the room. Garrett Cole sat there, arms still folded, but his back had inched slightly forward, no longer reclined. His eyes remained locked on the screen, but the contempt was gone. His jaw clenched, brows lowered. No one called his name. No one asked him to explain. But for the first time, his expression changed. Not because he was charged, not because of an accusation, but because, for the first time, a small piece of evidence, once thought lost, had spoken for a woman he never believed anyone would trust. Malik did not cry. The boy sat on a blue-cushioned chair, his legs gently swinging, holding a box of crayons. Across from him was a child psychologist specializing in trauma therapy. Her name was Aria. Slender in frame, hair tied high, her voice as soft as wind. The session was not labeled therapy. It was called a coloring conversation. She did not ask Malik what had happened, did not request him to retell it. She simply asked a gentle question. "Do you remember what your mom was wearing that night?" Malik nodded. "A blue hoodie with a hood." "Do you remember if she said anything?" She didn't have time. The answer made her pause her pen for a few seconds, but she didn't let it show. She placed a large sheet of paper in front of Malik. "If you want to draw what you remember most, go ahead. It doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be exact. Just whatever you still carry with you." Malik nodded. He picked up a black crayon. He did not choose a skin tone. He did not choose red. 2 hours later, Darius arrived to pick him up. Miss Aria didn't say much. She simply nodded at him and handed over Malik's drawing, temporarily pressed between a plastic board to keep it from folding. He accepted the drawing without looking closely. Only when they were home, after Malik had fallen asleep, did he truly open it. The page was nearly covered. In the bottom right corner was a figure lying face down, no blood, no visible injuries. But that body was smaller than any other figure on the page, lying still, arms not stretched, not moving. The hair was colored brown. The hoodie was blue. The face was left blank. Above was a larger figure, standing upright, also faceless, but holding something resembling a flashlight or baton. The entire figure was shaded in with thick black. So was the surrounding space, layered over so heavily that the paper had nearly torn in places. Next to it was a small shadow, probably Malik. The child was not beside his mother, nor was he running toward her. He just stood at a distance, arm outstretched, but unable to reach. Darius stared at that detail for a long time. Then his eyes moved to the pair of eyes drawn on the face of the figure lying on the ground. 2 small black dots, not round, not large, no expression, no anger, no fear, just as if they had been switched off. He set the drawing down on the table and leaned back in his chair. As a husband, he was used to having to hold everything in: anger, emotion, even helplessness. As a federal officer, he had been trained to stay calm in the face of evidence. As the lead on this investigation, he had handled hundreds of cases involving civil violence, but for the first time he had no idea what to do when confronted with a truth that wasn't inside a file, but drawn on a child's piece of paper. A child who didn't remember screaming, didn't remember blood, didn't remember sirens, only remembered that his mother was lying there, and her eyes no longer shone the way they used to. Malik's drawing remained on the table. Darius did not tell his son to put it away, nor did he file it away with the other pieces of evidence. The large sheet of paper, its edges slightly curled from heavy coloring, lay quietly among the case files, car keys, cell phone, and a cup of cold tea. Celeste saw it every day, and each time she looked, she didn't think of that night. She thought of what came after, when her son sat down and drew a world she never realized had been so deeply marked by her. That afternoon, Darius's phone buzzed. An email from a producer at a national news network. Not a local station, but a channel known for award-winning investigative journalism. The subject line, "Request to use visual for special feature." In the email body, the editor wrote, "We are producing a segment titled When Justice Steps on a Child's Memory, focusing on the invisible aftermath of administrative violence. Through a trusted source, we learned of the drawing your son created about the North Ridge incident. With utmost respect, we would like permission to use a copy of that drawing as the closing image for the feature. No narration, no commentary, just to appear exactly as it was drawn." Darius forwarded the email to Celeste. She did not respond immediately. She simply sat in front of the page, staring for a long time at the figure of the mother lying face down, those small, black, unmoving eyes, and the space Malik had left around her. She nodded. No explanation needed. No overthinking required. The drawing was scanned in high resolution the next morning. The news channel replied within an hour. "We will honor the promise. No edits, no political messaging, Just a Child and His Memory, Saturday night. The program aired during a time slot that wasn't prime time, not a peak hour. But no one expected what happened. Within less than 3 hours after the broadcast, the final segment of the show, the one with no narration, no interview, just the drawing, had spread across every social media platform. No one compared it to crime scene photos or audio clips, because for the first time, there was something that needed no words to speak, no background music to emphasize, no hashtags to be noticed, just a drawing made by a child's hand in which justice wore no armor, held no sword, and wore no blindfold. It simply stood there, coloring the whole page black and silencing a mother's eyes. One user wrote, "I've never cried because of a child's drawing. Now I can't even lift my head." Another account posted, "I stayed silent when I saw someone dragged from their car. I won't stay silent again because I just saw it through a child's eyes." No one tagged the artist. They didn't need to. Malik didn't need to draw for recognition, and the drawing didn't need a name to reach the place where words had failed too many times. 10 days after Malik's drawing aired on television, a stream of data began spreading quietly across an independent website called The Ledger. No logo, no listed founder, no advertisements, just an interactive map, gray background, red dots, each dot marking an incident, a location, a testimony once ignored, erased, or stamped insufficient grounds. In the center of the map was one name, Garrett Cole. No one knew who created it, but those following the Northridge case closely understood. This was not the work of an individual. It was the result of hundreds of testimonies, hundreds of stops without cause, hundreds of wounds without blood that still left scars. On the map, each point carried a date, time, neighborhood, and complaint reference number, most marked closed. But when a user clicked, they would see excerpts from the original statements. I was asked to step out of the car without any explanation. I was held because I looked unfamiliar. I don't remember what he said. I only remember how he pinned me to the ground. Most of those red dots listed the initial contact officer as Garrett Cole, or one of the officers who had patrolled with him. In the upper right corner of the screen, a list began to appear, not alphabetically, but in order of frequency in internal reports. Sergeant R. Klein, off, M. Rowe, Lieutenant Simmons. Those names had never been accused, never once mentioned in the articles, but now, one by one, each was placed at the center of a single question. If you did nothing wrong, what did you do when you witnessed something wrong? And then the first crack appeared. 3 days after the map began circulating, Lieutenant Daniel Simmons, who had shared the night shift with Garrett Cole in at least 8 documented incidents, sent a handwritten letter, formally typed on police department letterhead and published publicly on the same website. "I can no longer pretend I did not know. I witnessed it. I did not intervene. I signed off on reports because I believed that was how to keep myself safe. But each signature was a moment I surrendered my integrity." The letter ended with one line: "I apologize to those I was silent in front of. I will no longer remain in this force." The letter spread quickly. No one had forced him to write it. There was no public campaign pushing him. But that withdrawal marked something unprecedented. A police officer openly admitting that he had been part of the problem. After that, another officer quietly resigned. Another requested transfer, undeleted all their social media accounts, and refused every request for an interview. The machine no longer ran smoothly, not because someone had smashed it, but because each gear, once thought harmless, began pulling itself out of rotation, and the story, once erased, once folded away as a baseless complaint, was now being reread through a map, through an apology, through a quiet acknowledgement. No one is innocent if they saw and still turned away. Garrett Cole had yet to resurface, not at the precinct, not at any internal proceedings, not in a single meeting since. Those who once defended him, saying he followed protocol, that no one saw it directly, that maybe the camera did fail, had all gone quiet. That silence was not agreement. It was the first clear sign of a rupture, a slow but visible isolation of someone who had long been shielded the most. The incident map continued to update. Each day brought a few more red dots, not necessarily fatal cases, not even serious assaults, but just testimonies that had once been dismissed. And in nearly every single dot, the name Garrett Cole still appeared first in the line marked initial contact. Used to be described as a tough enforcer, the one willing to do what others avoided, never convicted because no one could prove him wrong. But now things were different. No one called him a lone bad actor anymore, because wrongdoing now had a structure, and he was no longer the main character, but the clearest symbol of a system built to conceal misconduct. On evening news programs, the commentary no longer circled the question, did Cole do something wrong? Instead, it asked, who let this go on for 5 years? One anchor said during the broadcast, Garrett Cole didn't hide in the shadows. He worked in broad daylight, logged everything, and filed reports by the book. His wrongdoing wasn't in concealment, it was in knowing full well that no one would ever hold him accountable. No one ends up like that by accident. No one builds a system alone. He had to be the product of that system. And as for the public, they began to see the boundary that had always been maintained under pretenses, the line between someone else's problem and something that could happen to me. Before, when someone was dragged out of a car in the middle of the night, people used to think, maybe that person did something wrong, maybe they had an attitude. That wouldn't happen to me. But now the questions had changed. People were no longer asking, who is Celeste Morgan? They were beginning to ask themselves, if someone like her, in a hoodie, carrying a child, coming home from work, can be treated that way, what makes my situation any different? It was no longer a story about one family, no longer a case about a brave couple. It had become a story that anyone could find themselves in if one night they took a wrong turn, drove too slowly, or simply existed at the wrong time. A high school teacher wrote on her blog, I used to teach my students how to distinguish between personal fault and systemic failure, but now I have to teach the reverse, that the system we call normal is sometimes the very place where wrong is born, and then teaches us to look away. A high school student wrote in his final essay, I no longer want to be a police officer like I used to. I want to become someone who writes the laws, because if the laws don't change, the system will just swap people out and repeat the same things. And inside the small house in Northridge, where a child once drew a picture so dark the paper nearly tore, Celeste sat quietly. She no longer needed to watch the news. She already knew what the rest of the country was only beginning to understand. Silence had once been the system's greatest strategy, but now, to speak up, even in the softest voice, was enough to start an aftershock. Outside the courthouse, more and more people began to show up, not to protest, not to take pictures. They simply stood there, reading the names on the wall, holding leaflets summarizing the case, quietly nodding when someone asked, who is she? And then, something few had expected started to happen. Schools in the area began incorporating the topic, Know Your Rights, into extracurricular lessons. No formal directive, no political pressure, just teachers who felt that, if they didn't do something, their students would grow up believing silence was the only way to survive. On Monday morning, at a public high school on the southern edge of North Ridge, an extracurricular session was held in a small ground-floor auditorium. There was no podium, no PowerPoint presentation, just a circle of plastic chairs, where 20 students sat surrounding a legal advocate invited from a local civil support center. On the whiteboard were 3 large lines written in marker, Know Your Rights. Police are not always right. If you feel mistreated, document it. The message wasn't loud, it wasn't radical, but for students who had grown up being taught to say yes sir no matter what, to keep their hands visible and their heads low, it was the first time they were told something else, that their voice wasn't just for answering, it was also for recording, remembering, and resisting when needed. The facilitator, a Latina woman with curly hair tied high and a warm voice, made it clear from the beginning, today there are no stupid questions. No experience is too small. You don't have to share your story. Just listen, or ask something you've never dared to ask. The session had been going for nearly 40 minutes. A few students asked, "If the police don't have a warrant to search my car, do I have to open it?" Another asked, "Do I have the right to record if I get pulled over?" Some students didn't ask anything, they just sat with their hands clasped, eyes lowered. Then a hand went up. It belonged to a girl sitting in the last row, wearing a white hoodie, her hair in braids, her gaze steady. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for the whole room to hear. "Miss, if I were white, would I have been beaten?" No one laughed. No one looked surprised. The room simply dropped into stillness, as if everyone had thought that question before, but never heard it spoken aloud. The facilitator inhaled gently, then nodded, as if to affirm it was a real question, and she wouldn't dodge it. She walked over, sat down in a nearby chair. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked softly, without judgment, "What do you think?" The girl paused for a beat, then said, "I think if my mom were white, maybe they would have asked, 'Do you need help, ma'am?' instead of dragging her out of the car." A boy added, "I got my backpack searched just for walking alone after school. My friend who was white was walking with me. Nothing happened to him. No one laughed. No one stayed silent." The conversation didn't become a fight. It became a mirror, where the kids could look and see the inequalities adults used to call sensitive topics, things to leave alone. When session ended, the facilitator said only one thing: "Your rights aren't just what's written down. They're what you have to know. So no one can take them from you by making you stay silent." And on that windy afternoon, a group of students walked home without saying much. But in their minds, that question still lingered, like a sharp, undeniable pin. If I were white, would I have been beaten? That class didn't end with the bell. As students trickled out of the auditorium, their homeroom teacher, Ms. Heller, remained seated in the front row, clutching her notebook without turning a single page. Her eyes were fixed on the question the girl in the back had asked. If I were white, would I have been beaten? She didn't have an answer, not because she didn't know, but because as a teacher she had been trained to stay neutral. But facing a room full of children wondering whether their very existence was suspicious, she realized silence in that moment was a form of complicity. That afternoon, she made a phone call, not to a counselor, not to an administrator, but to Celeste Morgan. Not to have her retell the pain, because the clips and news headlines had already done that far too well, but to have her simply show up as someone who still stood tall after being forced to lie face down. 2 days later, Celeste came to the school in a simple outfit. A long-sleeved blue shirt, jeans, no makeup. She didn't want to be the center of attention. She didn't need to be welcome like a hero. She just needed a chair and a room that knew how to listen. That room wasn't crowded like a TV broadcast. There were no cameras. Just over 20 students were seated around, including the girl who had asked the question the other day, and a few quiet teachers sitting in the back. Celeste didn't begin with the story of that night. She began with something else. "I'm not here to tell you what happened to me. I'm here to tell you surviving isn't the same as accepting. Surviving doesn't mean bowing your head and moving on. Surviving means learning how to stay standing and to look back, without letting the pain distort who you are." She paused. Her eyes swept across the young faces. Many didn't know where to look. Some stared straight ahead, unblinking. No one is born knowing how to say, "I have rights." You have to learn that, because the system doesn't teach it. And if your skin is brown or black or yellow, you have to learn it even sooner. Not to be rebellious, but to live fully. Not in hiding, not in silence, not asking permission, just to exist. A boy in the third row, slim, glasses, wearing a dark t-shirt, who had been quiet the whole time, finally whispered something aloud. Not loud, but enough for the person next to him to hear. "I see my mom in her." Celeste turned toward him but said nothing. Her gaze softened, not the tight, guarded look of someone who had been hurt, but the look of someone who understood that her presence was now a place for others to see they were not alone. After the talk, the students didn't applaud. No one took souvenir photos. There were just sheets of paper handed out to write down their thoughts, if they wanted. One student wrote, "She didn't teach me how to fight back. She taught me how not to sink when I've done nothing wrong." Another wrote, "I used to think silence was safety. Today I realize silence is only safe for people who have power." And so, before the trial even took place, a generation that had never fully understood what prejudice felt like began to realize that resisting injustice doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it's just daring to ask a question and refusing to let someone twist it into a fault. Not everyone in the profession was corrupt, but too many had chosen silence when they should have been the first to speak. On Tuesday morning, just before Celeste walked into her final meeting with her lawyer, Darius sent her a link. No explanation, just one sentence. "You should read this." The link led to a post on Reddit, a platform rarely considered the birthplace of anything serious. But this time it was different. The title read, "I'm a cop, and I stayed silent when I should have spoken up." The post was unsigned. The poster used a freshly created account with no profile picture, no personal information, but the language was too real, too detailed, too quiet to be fiction. "I'm a young cop, 3 years in. Garrett Cole was my field training officer during my first shifts in Northridge. I saw him hit someone. No reason, no warning. A woman was standing by the curb, talking on her phone. He walked up, asked loudly, 'What are you doing here?' She said waiting for a friend. Then he shoved her against the wall, searched her bag, cuffed her, said suspicious behavior. I stood there, I saw everything, but I said nothing because I was new, because everyone said he had protection, because when everyone ignored it, I learned to be quiet too. I'm sorry, not because I was forced to apologize, but because now I know. Every time I stayed silent, I pushed an innocent person closer to a cold wall." The post ended with a blank line. No hashtags, no pleas for forgiveness, no desperate cries for redemption. Just one sentence. "I'm writing this because I don't want to grow old and say, I didn't know, I knew, and I was wrong." In less than 3 hours, the post spread across platforms, not because of the number of likes, but because it hit the exact void that the entire system had avoided for too long. Those who saw but said nothing. In the comments section, the most unexpected thing happened. Others, also in law enforcement, began to share. Not spontaneous, unverified accounts, but quiet confessions from people tired of living between moral lines and professional comfort. One person wrote, "I used to be on shift with Cole. I once rewrote a report to match his statement. Not because I was cruel, but because if I didn't, I wouldn't be offered a permanent position. That's a choice I'm not proud of." Another said, "I'm not connected to Cole. I work in another state, but this story is exactly what I've seen. Edited reports, cameras losing signal, recruits being told, 'Don't get involved if you want to stick around.'" Within 24 hours, the original post drew more than 3,000 comments, not from civilians, but from those who once wore the badge. And that's what made the post no longer just an anonymous confession, but the first time the police force was forced to read what insiders had never dared to say aloud. The story was no longer about what Garrett Cole did. It was about how many people had known, had seen, had recorded it in their minds, but chose to erase it, thinking that was the price for peace in the ranks. And when the truth came out, not from media pressure, not from an internal order, but from a young, anonymous officer, the first to step out of that gray zone, the entire profession began to shake in ways no one could have imagined. Less than 24 hours after the young officer's anonymous post went viral, a simple phrase began appearing across social media platforms. "I'm not silent this time." There was no logo, no media campaign. It wasn't the product of any organization, just a line of text, sometimes in all caps, sometimes lowercase, standing alone in captions at the end of notes or handwritten on notebook covers, car windows, or poster boards at community meetings. That phrase started as a direct response to the confession. "I saw him beat someone and I stayed silent." But within a single morning, it became the echo of many others. not just from within law enforcement, but from the wider community of people who had once witnessed wrong, swallowed their first instinct, and convinced themselves it was not their place. An elementary school teacher wrote, "I once saw a student of color get his backpack searched for no reason. I ignored it. Am not silent this time." An administrative staffer posted, "I used to process complaint files and was told to prioritize the low-maintenance ones. I knew what that meant. I stayed quiet. Not anymore. Am not silent this time." A mother shared a blurry clip from a hallway camera where her 12-year-old son was stopped for a few quick questions by the school's security officer. The clip wasn't aggressive, no shouting, but in it was the panicked look of a boy being stopped mid-hallway for the crime of not walking in the designated lane. Before beginning of blurry photos, she wrote, "I deleted this once. But not this time. Am not silent this time." Not everyone dared to show their face. Not everyone was safe enough to speak out under their real name, but they began documenting, and more importantly, they stopped deleting. Blurry videos, grainy audio, clips showing nothing more than a sleeve, a corner of a street, a silhouette passing by, but each fragment that was saved felt like reclaiming a small piece of memory that the system had trained them to forget. Darius and Celeste didn't launch a campaign. They didn't post the hashtag. But each morning, when they opened their inbox, they found dozens more stories, hundreds of messages pouring into the secure address, from custodians to nurses to first-year law students. One person wrote, "I've never met you, but what you did made me realize I'm not crazy, not overly sensitive, not imagining things." Another said, "I don't know if my story helps anything, but for the first time, I'm not ashamed that I still remember." Celeste sat in front of the computer, unable to reply to them all, but with each message she read, it felt like something greater than her original fear was keeping her going. She looked over at Darius, the husband who had gone from a neutral official to the keeper of a collective memory. He didn't need to nod. She knew they had both felt the same thing. What they were doing, however small, had opened the first crack of light, a sliver just wide enough for hundreds of others to step through. They didn't need to shout. They didn't need to be heroes. They only needed to speak once, and this time not erase it. The courtroom of Federal District 9 was packed. No one spoke loudly. No one held up signs. But every pair of eyes was fixed on the judge's bench, the place from which the final words would be spoken after more than 6 months of testimonies, evidence, cross-examinations, rebuttals, and public backlash as heavy as a hammer. Garrett Cole sat at the defendant's table. He wasn't in uniform, nor was he in a suit, just a light gray button-down shirt, no tie, his hair cut shorter than during his first appearance. He no longer leaned back in his chair. Both hands rested in front of him, fingers laced tightly together, motionless. Celeste and Darius sat across from him, not looking at him. They didn't come to look back. They came to hear what the system had so often avoided. A conclusion, not perfect, but public. The judge flipped to the final page of the file. His voice rang out, not loud, not wavering. After thorough consideration of the records, testimonies, and evidence presented by both parties, the court finds the defendant Garrett Cole guilty of violating civil rights under Section 242, use of force without legal justification, causing physical and emotional harm to a citizen who posed no threat. A faint murmur rose from the back rows. People held their breath for what came next. However, due to insufficient conclusive evidence of racial bias at the time of the incident, and based on current sentencing guidelines, the court does not find the defendant guilty of systemic racial discrimination. No one applauded, no one shouted, but the room seemed to pause for a beat. Celeste lowered her head, her fingers gently clutching the hem of her shirt. Darius said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the judge's bench. Not disappointed, not satisfied, just a gaze that lingered, as if to commit every word to memory. The ruling declared Garrett Cole civilly liable, permanently stripped of his right to serve as a police officer, and sentenced to 2 years of probation. Not prison time, but federal supervision and a 10-year ban from holding any public office. Hours later, social media exploded. Headlines flooded the feeds. Guilty of violation, but racial bias goes unnamed. public opinion is split. One side was furious. Why still hesitate to call out what is so clearly there? The other side was deflated. So after all that evidence, someone like him still doesn't get called what he is? People waited for a reaction from Celeste, from Darius, from the family that, for the past 6 months, had become a symbol of endurance and resolve. But they made no public statement at the post-trial press conference. They didn't stand behind a microphone. They didn't post a thank you note or rallying message. They left the courthouse the same way they came in, without spectacle, not needing anyone's agreement to know they were right. That evening, when a reporter knocked on their door asking for an interview, Darius sent out a single printed page, not long, unsigned. It contained just one paragraph. We don't need a perfect verdict. We need the world to see that, as of today, Garrett Cole is no longer safe under the shield of the law. And every other officer who has acted as he once did now knows that the light at the end of the tunnel is no longer theirs alone. He didn't lift his head when the judge read the sentence. His hands remained in front of him, but his knuckles had turned white, clenched tighter than at any point before. No one could quite read Garrett Cole's expression anymore, but to those who had watched him since the first day of trial, the smug posture, the unapologetic scorn in his eyes, the fact that he stayed silent long enough was enough. He was not convicted of racial bias, but he was no longer a cop. In the sentencing notice sent to the Department of Internal Affairs just 2 hours later, the note was unequivocal. Revocation of law enforcement credentials, forfeiture of all badges, firearm licenses, and access privileges to enforcement databases. No suspension pending review. No supplemental justification. Just a directive as sharp as a blade slicing through armor once thought impenetrable. He no longer belonged to the system. The badge, that symbol of fear and deference, more powerful than any title, was ordered to be surrendered by 6 o'clock that evening. The order came with a handover form bearing an internal designation, Status Transfer Code X.19, meaning no longer eligible for reintegration at any legal or administrative level. And when he signed that form in the county administrative office, a staff member later recalled he didn't look at the badge one last time. He didn't ask why. He just signed, very quickly, very cleanly, but with a hand that trembled slightly. That evening, former colleagues didn't call to check in. No messages, no casual invites to blow off steam. He lost his job, lost his badge, lost access to all operational systems, but above all, he lost what had sustained him all these years. Immunity. He had walked past countless complaints, shielded by the silence of his superiors, had been tipped off before internal affairs visits, had colleagues revise reports to preserve the official language in his paperwork, had worn extremist symbols and brushed them off as Halloween costumes, had pinned people to the pavement and walked away without glancing back, believing the law was merely an extension of his arm, untouchable. But this time it was the law that made him stop. As he stepped out of the courtroom, the midday sun hit his face, not blinding, but bright enough to make him squint, and then lower his gaze. No one shouted his name, no one threw bottles. There was no furious crowd waiting outside, just a long hallway, silent on both sides, where reporters held up their cameras, but didn't jostle, didn't yell out question, because the one moment they had all been waiting for had arrived. Garrett Cole, the man who once walked past accusations as if they were dust, bowed his head for the first time as he left the courthouse. Not to hide, but because there was nothing left to hold his head high anymore. No badge on his chest to impose authority, no nameplate for others to answer with yes, sir. No title to justify lifting his chin without meeting the eyes of those now questioning the very system he served. Darius watched from a distance. Celeste did not look, because they both knew the one thing that needed to be seen was now clear. He was still alive, but he no longer walked the way he used to. Nearly 3 weeks after the trial, the invitations started coming in. A national television network offered an exclusive interview. A documentary company hinted at turning the story into a mini-series. A publishing house suggested a memoir. People began calling her by many titles: modern-day heroine, The Woman Who Made Justice Look in the Mirror. Each title was like a frame, beautiful but confining. She read through them all, then put them away. She continued her housework as usual, and still took Malik to school every morning. Her legal representative once suggested considering a press interview because the public needs to know more about you, but she shook her head. No hesitation, no excuses. Just a short reply. People don't need to know anything more. I said what needed to be said in court. To her, what was necessary for the world to understand had already been enough. The rest, if there was any, should be left for others to tell, not to praise her, but to ensure they would not have to repeat her. Darius could not avoid the spotlight either. A formal invitation with an official red seal from the Department of Justice arrived at their home, offering to honor him for breakthrough contributions in internal oversight reform. The medal was described as a symbol of change from within the system. He opened the letter late at night, after Malik had gone to sleep. He read each line carefully, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. The next morning, he hand-wrote a reply. I know the invitation was written in good faith, but if what I did was right, then it is what anyone in the profession should have done. When the system rewards someone for doing the bare minimum, the reward itself reveals the problem. He did not include a photo. He did not offer a speech. He did not appoint a proxy, just a signature and a simple reason. I want peace, and I want the system to understand that decency should not be the exception. When a veteran journalist sent an email asking how they wished to be remembered, Celeste wrote a response so brief it bordered on cold. Not to hurt anyone, but to protect the truth. I don't want to be remembered as anyone. I don't need my name in textbooks. I don't need anyone to make a film. I don't need to become a symbol for others to lean on. I just want that if some woman gets stopped in the middle of the night while carrying her child home, she won't have to explain why she exists. And if her child sees it, they won't grow up learning how to forget it. Then she ended the message. I don't need to be seen as someone special. I only hope no one else has to live through what I did. On Thursday morning, a major magazine released its monthly special issue. Darius was making coffee when the notification appeared on his phone. He opened the link out of habit, then froze at the familiar image that filled the cover. Celeste, standing at the steps of the federal courthouse. Her hair was slightly tousled by the wind. A pale blue button-up shirt, arms relaxed at her sides. Her face showed no anger, no pride, just a steady gaze, looking straight into the camera. There was only one headline, centered over a white background. When silence doesn't look away. Celeste had forgotten that moment. That day, after the trial ended, she had only paused for a few seconds on the courthouse steps. Reporters crowded both sides. Many called her name, asked questions in a flurry. She didn't answer. She didn't turn away. She just stood there for a moment, not for a photo, but simply because she hadn't yet found the strength to take another step. And yet that photo was chosen as the symbol, not because she said anything, but because, in the noisiest moment, there was one person who remained still, not stepping back, not needing to step forward, and that alone was enough to make others pause and look. The image spread quickly. No media campaign, no rallying hashtag, just someone saw it, then shared it, and from there it moved. People didn't comment on her outfit, didn't speculate about the backstory. They focused on one thing. She didn't need to explain. And still, an entire system was forced to examine itself. A journalist wrote, "For the first time, I understand how someone can cause change, not through words, but by refusing to look away." Celeste didn't reshare the photo. When a neighbor asked if she felt proud, she smiled. "I feel lucky, because this time, someone saw." As for Darius, he didn't frame the photo, didn't hang it on a wall. He tucked it into the middle of an old notebook, the one where he had written his first lines when filing the initial request for investigation. "We'll start again, not by shouting, but by recording, clearly, completely, no one erased." Now he understood that quiet presence, that stillness, was what forced people to shift their perspective. Celeste never wanted to be a hero, and what got her on that magazine cover had nothing to do with a title. They chose her because, at a time when everyone spoke too much, judged too fast, and deflected too smoothly, there was a woman who didn't walk away and didn't reach for a microphone either. She stood there, long enough for others to ask themselves, what would I do if I were standing right there? That morning, the sky was unusually clear. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, quietly settling on the breakfast table where a few crumbs of bread remained. Celeste was making tea when Malik walked in, toy car still in hand, eyes drowsy but voice clear. So, did we win, Mom? She didn't answer right away. Her 6-year-old son's question didn't carry the complexities of adulthood. He only needed an answer. Short, simple, definite, but that very simplicity caught in her throat. Darius turned slightly as if about to say something, then didn't. The kitchen fell quiet for a moment. Celeste poured the tea, sat the cup down, sat next to her son. No one's won yet, Malik, she said. But if someday someone gets to go home without being pulled out of their car, if someone like your mom doesn't get thrown to the ground, doesn't get forced to be quiet, then that's a win. The boy nodded as if he understood, but he didn't ask anything else. Maybe for him, that was enough. A week later, they moved away. No farewell party, no goodbyes, no social media updates about their new location. The moving truck took just over 3 hours to leave the city where everything had happened, to a small town near the woods, where birds sang in the morning, where the porch was wide enough for 2 wooden chairs, and where the elementary school sat on a street with no traffic lights. People speculated they left because they were exhausted. Some said they feared being watched. Others believed they were left out of disappointment with the verdict. Only they knew the truth. They weren't running. They left because they knew they deserved to keep living. Darius started working remotely. Celeste planted vegetables in the backyard. Malik entered 1st grade, made a best friend named Eli, and spoke of his mother with an ease that made it sound like everyone had one. A mother who once stood in a crowd and never looked away from what was right. None of the 3 spoke of the incident again, but every night, sitting on the porch and listening to the wind rustle through the trees behind the house, Celeste knew there was one thing she carried with her that didn't need packing: the belief that silence can shake an entire machine if held at the right moment. And there was something else, a small seed, unnamed, but strong enough to break through the ground once trampled. The understanding that sometimes continuing to live is its form of resistance, and leaving is how you replant kindness somewhere new. One autumn afternoon, the sky was cloudy, but the wind was gentle. Celeste sat at the dining table, preparing dinner, when Malik came home from school, backpack hanging off one shoulder, holding a piece of paper, folded in thirds. Teacher said we'd get extra credit if we turned it in early, but I didn't, because I wanted you to read it first. He handed her the paper. The lines were printed in faint blue boxes. The handwriting still uneven, some strokes bold, some faint, but Celeste recognized it immediately. Malik's end-of-term essay for 1st grade. The topic was, "The person I most want to write about." She unfolded the paper. Her heartbeat slowed. My parents didn't fight back with fists. They fought with the truth. The first sentence stole her breath for a moment. The boy continued. My mom didn't run when they pulled her out of the car. My dad didn't yell when they lied. But they didn't stay silent. They did something else. They held on to the story. Then they told it to someone who listened. And then others started telling their stories too. And I think if everyone tells the truth, then bad people won't have anywhere to hide. Celeste held the paper, her hands trembling slightly. Not because the emotions were too strong, but because the words were too direct, too simple, and yet carried the weight of something she had spent a lifetime fearing Malik might never understand. She turned to Darius, who was outside trimming vegetables. She handed him the paper, didn't say a word. He read it, then folded it carefully, like a classified document. They looked at each other. No smile, no tears, but in their eyes was a silent confirmation. They had done the right thing, not for themselves, but for a child growing up with the belief that kindness does not mean defeat. Celeste used to fear that her son would grow up remembering a mother pinned to the ground and a father who wrote petitions in silence. She had been haunted by the image of Malik in the back seat that day, crying as her blood dripped onto his shirt. But today, reading those scribbled words, she knew. Malik didn't remember the humiliation. He remembered how his parents chose not to let anger pull them down. And because of that, in the mind of a 6-year-old boy, strength was no longer defined by yelling, violence, or power, but by truth. By the act of retelling, wrongdoing could no longer hide behind the phrase, "Nobody said anything." They hadn't changed the whole system. The court didn't deliver perfect justice. The slowness, the compromise, the inertia, they still ran as usual out there. But today, in the small kitchen of a quiet town, 2 adults silently understood something. They had saved at least one child from believing that enduring was something to be memorized. That night, Malik fell asleep early. Outside, the first yellow leaves of the season dropped quietly onto the steps. Celeste remained at the table, the soft yellow light spilling over the essay her son had left behind. She didn't fold it. She didn't cry. There was only one feeling that reached the deepest part of her at that moment, the peace that comes after a long battle. Not because everything had been fixed, but because now she knew. Her kindness had reached far enough to plant something, not in a rally, but in a child's quiet faith. East South Ridge Suburban High School, early June. In the classroom at the end of the hallway, the teacher asked students to write their final essay. Describe someone you've never met who changed the way you think. Among dozens of submissions turned in on time, featuring celebrities, entrepreneurs, writers, and artists, there was one paper just over a page and a half long, slightly crumpled, with handwriting that was steady but still awkward. It began with a single slow sentence. "I never met her, but because of her, I know I have the right to ask." In the far corner of a small-town library on the outskirts of Maine, there were no signs, no motivational posters hanging from the walls. The room, barely 40 square meters, had been converted from an old storage shed. Bare brick walls, wooden shelves made from reclaimed boards, and yellow light from a ceiling lamp dimmed by dust and age. Children stopped by on weekends to read picture books. Elderly folks sometimes came looking for old novels. There were no barcode scanners or digital catalog systems, but near the door, on a low shelf, sat a glass display case. Inside it lay something only those who had followed the trial back then would recognize, an expired U.S. Marshal badge, its owner's name no longer in the system. Below the badge was a small, soft-bound notebook, pages yellowing. The notebook was thin. It held no entries aside from a single line, handwritten in faded blue ink. "Don't think justice is something grand. Sometimes it's just the act of not looking away." No author was listed, no date, no indication it was a historical artifact, but the librarian still told anyone who asked. They placed it here on a quiet morning, no speeches, no press. They just said, "This place is enough." Darius had carried the badge. Celeste held the notebook. They wiped the glass case with their hands and set it on the shelf, once used for stacking old law books. No one took a picture. No ceremony named the display. They left as if they had just given up something deeply personal, but enough for someone else to hold on to. They didn't build a statue. They didn't leave a note about a victory. They didn't explain why they chose this place instead of a local archive or museum. Perhaps because they understood. True symbols don't need to stand in the middle of a plaza. They only need to appear at the right moment. So someone losing faith might pause and realize they're not walking alone. The badge, now incapable of opening any doors of privilege, the notebook, holding no strategy, no plan, no rallying cry. But side by side, they were a reminder. Justice doesn't always come from courtrooms. Sometimes it begins with someone staying put when everyone else turns away. That little library doesn't appear on tourist maps, nor is it mentioned in any local cultural guidebooks. But on an August afternoon, as a light rain tapped against the frosted glass, A teenager with a rain-soaked backpack stopped at that display case and stayed for a long time. He stared at the dulled silver badge, then rested his gaze on the notebook. There was no background music, only a single line of handwriting sitting alone on a blank white page. Don't think justice is something grand. Sometimes it's just the act of not looking away. The librarian, a white-haired woman named Eileen, glanced over from her desk. She'd seen hundreds of people stop at that glass case. Students, teachers, legal professionals, and even the occasional passing traveler. No one took pictures. No one raised their phones, but almost all of them stood still, longer than usual, as if something had quietly brushed against them that they couldn't yet name, as if they had just relearned something, not from a curriculum, but from a silence they had forgotten how to listen to. No one declared this a symbol. No monument was built, no ribbon cutting, no speeches, no guests of honor. But those who had passed by remembered exactly where that display case sat, the third shelf on the left, under the old wooden window, where the morning light was always just warm enough to cast a thin beam across the glass. And in that place, people didn't read with their eyes. They read with... A mother once came to the library with her 6-year-old daughter. Standing before that display case, she quietly pulled her child closer. She said nothing, but her eyes held a gentle sorrow, like the words on the page had stirred something old in her, something that had finally been named. A law student copied the sentence verbatim into their notebook, next to the heading, Redefining the Meaning of Civic Duty. A retired police officer, gray-hailed and walking with a cane, visited alone on a Monday morning. He didn't read aloud, but when he left, someone saw him take a pen and write on a small slip of paper, which he placed in front of the display. Thank you for not looking away when we did. As for Darius and Celeste, they never returned to the library after the day the display case was placed. They didn't need to, because everything they had wanted to leave behind was already there, and they understood. If they had to do it all again, they would still choose the quiet path, still choose to stand, still choose to leave something not to be praised, but so that others might pause just long enough to listen to themselves. In a world full of pressure to respond fast, speak loud, and declare clear positions, sometimes the real strength lies in this: who has the resolve not to be swept along. No one asked them to become symbols. They never accepted such a role. But that silver badge and the thin notebook, along with a single unadorned sentence, had already spoken for them. North Ridge Police Department, Naartala. September. On the second floor, the conference room down a hallway once reserved for plaques and temporary file storage now held a whiteboard. There were no arrest diagrams, no patrol schedules by zone, only one question written in the center. Am I doing this because of their skin color? It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't a campaign. It certainly wasn't a moral declaration. It was the first question written into the new intervention protocol, a set of internal guidelines drafted by Northridge's youngest officers. The people who wrote it were not senior leadership, not supervisors. They were a group of 8 young officers, average age not yet 30, who had only been in the force a few years, but had already seen enough to understand. If the way an encounter begins doesn't change, then every other reform is just fresh paint. The first draft didn't mention suppression tactics. It didn't call for more weapons or better gear. Instead, it began at the place no one expected, the actual reason behind decision-making. Am I pulling this car over because of a broken taillight? Or because the person inside looks different? Am I asking for ID because I truly need to verify something? Or because they make me feel uneasy for reasons I can't name? And among all the technical procedures, the young officers inserted one section that had never existed in any rulebook before: a 10-second internal pause. Not a pause in action, a pause in thought, an interruption of the mental reflexes built over years of conditioning, to ask themselves, if this person had a different skin color, would I be doing the same thing? For the first time in internal history, The word bias appeared in a departmental manual without quotation marks, without footnotes softening its weight. No one ordered them to write it that way. It was the younger officers who sat down together late one night after shift, when one of them described almost stopping someone simply because he looked like he didn't belong here, but then paused, not out of fear of breaking policy, but because an image flashed through his mind of a woman that night, blood on her son's shirt, all because she had exited her car too slowly. The head of Human Resources initially believed this draft was more symbolic than practical, but after the three oldest officers on the team, who had previously distanced themselves from federal investigations, all signed in support, the draft was uploaded to the official system. 1 week later, every night patrol team in North Ridge was issued the new guideline. For the first time, notes appeared that read, "Skin color must not be a substitute for matching description. If no specific features are present, walk away. Communication is not meant to dominate. It is meant to understand that the person in front of you might be the most innocent one in your day. And most importantly, if you find yourself hesitating, that is not weakness, it is a signal that you are relearning how to be human before being an officer." The end-of-month briefing at North Ridge Police Department usually lasted only 20 minutes, going over patrol schedules, shift assignments, and a few administrative reminders. But that day, no one looked at the clock. A young officer, Marcus Dunn, 31 years old, newly appointed supervisor for the Southern Residential Sector, was invited to say a few words about the new protocol he and his team had just proposed. But Marcus didn't look at the document. He stood upright, hands empty, eyes steady. "We've spent a long time trying to protect the image of the department, but justice is not something preserved through silence." He looked around the room. "I know many people used to think if a fellow officer is wrong, the first responsibility is to cover for them. But if what we're covering is wrongdoing, then that's no longer a teammate. That's an accomplice." He lowered his voice, but there was no tremble in it. "We don't need to protect the department. We need to protect justice, because when a department is built on wrongs, what we're preserving is no longer a profession. It's a shell." The room fell completely silent. No one coughed. No hands tapped lightly on the table. An older officer sitting in the far left corner, someone who had once patrolled with Garrett Cole, leaned slightly forward, hands clasped in front of his mouth. His eyes didn't look at Marcus, but down at the floor, as if remembering something long past that still weighed heavily. After the meeting, there was no applause, no formal statements of thanks, but in the eyes of many younger officers, there was a quiet consensus. Someone had finally said what needed to be said without disclaimers. That same afternoon, a small action was taken. Without permission. A white sheet of paper, printed with bold black letters, was stuck to the back of every patrol car's driver's seat. It followed no official template. It bore no logo, but it was affixed with strong double-sided tape, as if someone wanted to ensure it wouldn't fall off easily. The only line on the paper read, "Don't be the next Garrett Cole." No one came forward to claim responsibility for doing it. A few days later, another officer, formerly an assistant in the Internal Affairs Unit, printed more copies, then more. Soon, every patrol car in North Ridge had that paper in the corner of the rearview mirror. Not mandated, but no one removed it, and something strange had begun to happen. In internal audio recordings, the frequency of the question, "Do we have a solid reason?" increased noticeably. Approach reports started getting longer, not because they needed to justify themselves, but because officers wanted to read them back and feel convinced by their own decisions. In that silence, people began to understand. No grand statement was necessary, just enough young officers willing to admit that staying silent was no longer a neutral choice. On a Friday night, light rain began to fall. Patrol Unit 4 received a call from a grocery store reporting suspicious behavior outside. 2 officers were dispatched to the scene. A man stood outside, an old jacket, hands in pockets, showing no signs of disturbance. He was just there, staring through the glass as if waiting for someone to come out. The glow of the streetlight cast across his face, making his expression hard to read. A year ago, there might have been a request for a search. Someone might have demanded his ID right away. A hand may have reached for the radio to call for backup, just because his silence had been misread as a threat. But that night, instead of placing a hand on his belt, the young officer stepped forward, his voice calm and low. "Sir, do you need any help?" The man turned around, looking surprised. Then he said, very softly, "I'm waiting for my daughter to finish shopping, just holding her coat." The two young officers didn't immediately retreat, but they also didn't escalate their presence into pressure. They simply stood there a little longer, then nodded and walked away. From initial caution in their eyes, they moved toward a quiet realization. They had moved too quickly past people who might have just needed someone to pause and listen. And then, something not written into any manual began to quietly spread through the internal culture. Sometimes, the duty of someone in uniform is to stand still the way victims once did, not to exert power, but to prove that this time, the one standing still isn't there to harm anyone. On that late autumn afternoon, the sky was a clear blue, as if nothing terrible had ever happened in that park. The rows of trees lining the walkway had started to shed their leaves, forming a soft brown and gold carpet where children jumped about as if the world were an endless game. Celeste walked slowly along the old stone path, holding Malik, who was now nearly 7 years old. He still clutched his red toy truck, the one he'd held onto since they left the city. His small face rested against her neck, eyes drifting lazily around until Celeste stopped. She turned her head, looking toward a corner near the tree line where the ground dipped slightly and the sunlight couldn't quite reach. Then, with a voice as light as wind brushing through branches, she said, "Over there, Malik. That's where I once lay on the ground." The boy tilted his head, following the direction her hand pointed. "Mama?" "Yes, you were still asleep in the car back then. But I remember the smell of the earth that day. I remember my heartbeat pounding in my neck, not because I was scared, but because I never thought that just by walking a little slower, someone would decide I deserved that." Malik didn't ask anything else. He didn't ask why. He didn't need his mother to repeat what had been done or by whom. He simply reached out his hand, small but steady, and gripped his mother's hand tightly. That grip didn't come from fear. It came from something deeper, a quiet pride that a child doesn't need to be taught, that the mother holding him today was once pulled down to the ground, but now still standing upright and without needing to hide it. The two continued walking. Celeste didn't look back again. She didn't need to. But someone else had witnessed that moment. A middle-aged woman, slender in build, wearing a light gray coat, was walking her dog on the opposite side. She didn't come closer, nor did she act like she recognized anyone. But as she passed the mother and child, she gave a gentle nod. That was all. Just a nod, long enough for Celeste to recognize that it wasn't a random courtesy. It was a silent acknowledgement between women who had once known what it meant to hold their ground in a world that always tried to push them back. Celeste tilted her head slightly in return. No words, no smile, but her gaze softened, as if she had just seen a part of herself in the figure of that woman, someone who had once been seen as too ordinary to be heard, but who had refused to walk away. From a distance, children's laughter rang out again. Malik turned and asked, "Can I go play on the slide for a bit, Mama?" She nodded. Set him down. The boy ran toward the playground, his feet as light as the early winter breeze. Celeste stayed where she was, watching him run into the sunlight. No more blood, no more invisible chains, only steady breathing and the small footsteps of a child learning how to walk through life without bowing his head. That afternoon, as Celeste and Malik left the park, the sun began to set behind the distant row of houses. The wind rustled through the tree branches, casting shadows that blurred across the ground. But Malik still glanced back, one last time, at the spot his mother had pointed to. The scar was no longer visible, but the imprint in his memory was clearer than ever. There, where a mother had once been forced to the ground, her blood staining her son's shirt. And there, too, now were the steps of a child running toward the slide, his small back no longer carrying fear, but carrying the memory of pride. And in that very place, a woman had once refused to look away. In this world, there are thousands of courtrooms, millions of statutes, and countless definitions of justice. But justice truly begins at the moment someone, though smaller, weaker, or more wounded, still refuses to bow their head, not to win, but so that no one else has to bow theirs again. That same evening, in a small library, another child wrote their final term paper. I've never met her, but because of her, I know I have the right to ask. And when my friend asks back, I'll be the one who stands still, so they don't feel alone. The first page of the notebook beneath the glass frame remains blank. No name, no date. But now it's no longer just space. It's a place reserved for the next person, if they're ready to continue the story, to write it with words, with timely voices, with eyes that don't look away when someone is treated unfairly, with a single step forward while others step back. No one calls Celeste a hero. She never needed anyone's validation. But if one day her son gets to grow up in a city where no one has to be afraid because of their skin color, where every police officer knows to pause and ask, am I doing this because of who they are, or because I was trained to think this way, then that will be a victory with no medals, no podium, only the kind of freedom a child should never have to earn through pain. Justice doesn't have to start in a courtroom. It starts with how we hold our gaze and choose not to look away. And when one person does that, another will follow, then a third, and that is enough. The child didn't ask why. He held his mother's hand tighter, not out of fear, but with pride, as if courage could pass through skin from a hand that never pulled away. No one knows her name from textbooks, but anyone who has looked into her eyes will always remember this, that some people don't need to say much, don't need to shout. Simply by refusing to look away, they manage to preserve a sliver of light for the world. Justice doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes as a nod between strangers, or as a hand being held, just when someone is about to let go, or as a question quietly carried in a child's heart. If I see something wrong, can I choose to stand still? And if someone is willing to stand, even just one person, then that is how change begins.